Welcome to the Shunned podcast, where we get to hear stories from people that have been silenced by controlling religions. Today we're going to hear from DJ, a guy that is shunned by Jehovah's Witnesses so that they don't have to face the truth. Before we get started, I wanted to introduce the new format. Some of you probably noticed that things have changed at times from episode to episode, and honestly, that's because I'm trying to find the right mix here. When I was done doing my other podcast called This JW Life, where I told my personal story, I was contacted by others, and people wanted me to help them tell their story. To be quite honest, I wasn't really ready for it. Telling my story was a big deal. I was kind of overwhelmed by it all to some extent, and so when others wanted me to help them to tell their stories, I was doing it, but honestly, I wasn't that comfortable with it. So at first, my goal was to keep myself out of the interview. I didn't want to make this podcast about me. I just did one about me, and that level of vulnerability was kind of tiring. So I felt like I was thrown into an interviewer's role, but I wasn't really comfortable with my abilities as an interviewer. It's not something I've ever really done before. So as a result, I would remove my audio and produce more individualized stories. Well, over time, some of the people that I interviewed asked me to be in the story with them. They said it would make them more comfortable, but honestly, it was making me more uncomfortable. Then came David in these last episodes, and his story was so involved that I couldn't edit it. I had to leave me in it, and it kind of pushed me out there as an interviewer. I've received some feedback from people that liked having me in it more, and I've been asked to be in it more by the people that I've interviewed. So now you're stuck with me. I'm finding my voice as an interviewer, I hope, and people seem to like it, so I'm going to try to go ahead and settle in here now. I'm feeling more comfortable as an interviewer, but I'm trying to stay out of the way as much as possible because I still want the focus to be on the person that I interview. But I hope to add my own flavor in my own way. With this episode, the podcast will go over 7,000 downloads, which is amazing to me. This JW Life, my original podcast, which covered my story and the cult of Jehovah's Witnesses, has now gone over 18,000 downloads. So it's exciting to know that these are making some sort of a difference and to hear feedback from people. So let's go ahead and get into DJ's story, and afterward I'm going to give some more information that you'll want to stick around for.
My name's DJ. I'm 27 years old. I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and I am shunned.
How did you come to be one of Jehovah's Witnesses? You know, like what age were you born in? Did you come in later? How'd that develop?
So I was actually born into the Jehovah's Witness religion. So that was just a lifestyle that I had always known. So that would be making me a third generation member. So my grandmother met a man in the 60s, and she had my dad and his sister with a man, and they were both worldly at the time. So obviously worldly meaning somebody who doesn't serve or bow down or get baptized by water immersion to Jehovah, or more importantly, the Watchtower organization and its interpretation of the Bible. But these were just two people that met each other, had children, and they were just they themselves trying to grasp, the wonders of the world and questioning death. Why do we die? What happens to our dead loved ones? And is there life after death? So to the best of my knowledge, and later in my life, as I'd come to find out that man that she had met was just a real piece of shit. Basically, he was my dad's real dad, and my real grandfather, and my grandma tried to made it work with him, but ultimately he wanted nothing to do with her or any of his children. So later in the 60s, she separated from that man and met my step grandfather, and he was in the war, and they would get to know each other and decide ultimately through friends eventually that they met that that they were going to become one of Jehovah's Witnesses and raise their children. My dad and his sister in that organization. So, my dad was basically born and raised in it. At 2 years old, he was introduced to it from his parents. Yeah. And so, yeah, he grew up as a Jehovah's Witness. And that's basically how I would be later introduced to it. My dad, he made it sound growing up that he was never really into it. It was just kind of a formality. My grandfather was extremely, possessive and oftentimes, physically and emotionally abusive. And he would later become an elder. And he would still, yeah, of course. Yeah. That's just kind of the process, the ladder you climb, right?
Yeah.
And my grandfather was a, pretty successful person. He owned his own business, and my dad would grow up to work with him. And at a certain point, as my dad was getting older, both him and his sister started getting, into trouble with bad association. And he would ultimately, his sister before him got baptized, and she was younger than him at the time, but I think she was, 18 or 19 when she got disfellowship for having relations with an unbeliever of Jehovah's Witnesses. And she would later get disfellowshipped for her wrongdoing or unrepentantness. And she would never return. So it's been, 30 years, almost 30 years now that she's been out. And my dad, like I said, he wasn't baptized when his sister was, but he ultimately made the choice to leave as well and kind of do his own thing and be worldly and go off and, live the life that he thought he was missing out on. And it just didn't, like I said, my dad growing up, when he just made it seem like it was nothing he was really, really interested into, or, it was just something that he had to do. So once he was out of, the organization, he moved to the LA area along the coast, and he just spent a couple of years outside the organization doing his own thing. And at which point he ended up having my daughter, my half sister, with a woman, and they wouldn't stay together, but they would share custody of her. And then, a year or two after that, he would meet my mom outside of the Jehovah's Witness organization, and she was worldly, and she was raised Catholic, so she was raised around religion herself. And when they met each other, they would talk about beliefs often. And my dad was trying to tell her exactly how he grew up and the good things about the organization. And no doubt, you can't blame her for when she found out exactly the ins and outs of the organization and what he was raised in. She's like, "What are you doing? You have the truth." So ultimately, she would convince my dad to return and start studying. But
oh, wow.
Yeah, so they were both out when they met. And she, like I said, would convince him to ultimately return and for them both to study. So, and take into consideration at this time now, my mom's pregnant with me. So I think that was maybe a determining factor too, of them just evaluating their life situation and, trying to understand their next move. So
I think that happens a lot. Yeah.
Yeah. And I think it was more out of pressure, when people get to that point in their life where they have to reevaluate their situation because they might not be in a good place. And I know my dad told me that when he was outside of the organization, he got, he dabbled in drugs and got into trouble, and obviously their lives weren't the best that they could be. And they had to sit down and talk to each other about, okay, what are we going to do now? We're, pregnant with DJ, me. So they would return. And then, like I said, my mom was baptized with me, and they would go to Vegas actually and elope. So they got married, and then shortly after that, they got baptized.
Wow.
Yeah.
So then were you baptized while she was pregnant?
I believe so. Yeah, I'm not 100% sure, but I believe while she was still pregnant, they both got baptized together.
Maybe there's some way you could have gone back and annulled your baptism somehow through
I know.
that.
Yeah, I never considered that maybe I was baptized twice. I was double dipped.
So it was invalid. Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then that's really interesting. I think that there are a lot of people who, when they have a kid, start to reevaluate things. And it's fascinating that it happens to have been your mom that
Right.
was never a witness that, got you guys back into it, or got your dad back into it. That's a unique course. So your parents are baptized. Obviously you come into the world. What did it mean to you to be a Jehovah's Witness back then? What was the worldview you were given, even as a little kid?
Well, like I said, it was just something I always knew. It was just a way of life that was conditioned, into me unbeknownst. So this was typical. I just thought that every family was like this. And I would later come to find out that that wasn't the case when I would start school. So growing up, before school, I remember a lot of arguments, a lot of verbal abuse from both ends of my parents, just because of them going through the struggle of trying to make it work with a new child in this organization. My dad was starting his own business, and at the time, my mom and dad were both fighting for full custody of my half sister. So before school, I remember, my earliest memory was 2 years old, and it was just extreme arguments and verbal abuse and shouting, and that's just my earliest memories of my family before school. So, but when I started school, that's when the indoctrination really kicked in, because Jehovah's Witnesses, right off the bat, if your parents are really trying, they're gonna help you understand that you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses and how to stand up for your beliefs. So the first day of school, weeks before the first day of kindergarten, I remember my mom sitting down with me and going over what would be my first demonstration, essentially, of walking up to my kindergarten teacher and telling him in front of the class and their parents that I was one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and handing him, Jehovah's Witness publication, which I don't exactly remember which one it was, but it was probably Life, How Did It Get Here by Evolution or Creation. So, and then I went straight into I didn't salute the flag and the reason why, and just went into that whole mumbo jumbo and standing up for my faith system, my belief system right off the bat.
Wow. And you had to do that, did you say in front of other kids and like their parents?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like an orientation or something?
Yeah, exactly. So the first day, all the kids are sitting around on the ground, and, you'd be introduced by the teacher, and you'd stand up and say your name. And that's when I had, my book or whatever it was exactly. I don't remember, but that's when I would stand up and say, I'm DJ. I'm one of Jehovah's Witnesses, and, I don't salute the flag. And in my mind, it was just raising controversy right off the bat.
Yeah. That's a heavy place for a kid that early.
Right. And I remember pretty distinctively wondering why I necessarily had to do that like that.
Yeah.
But I didn't really understand the ramifications to its fullest extent, because I was so young. But it did raise, an eyebrow to me, like, why is this absolutely necessary? So, and it was already a daunting enough task to stand up in front of all of those people that I didn't know, that young, and right off the bat, just kind of already shoving it down their throats, like this is what to be expected from me.
That's welcome to your life.
Right.
You
Yeah.
know, I mean,
As early as that,
wow, that's real heavy to put on a kid. And obviously, like you said, it didn't have to be done that way. That could have been done in private. That was just making a point and making a spectacle.
Right. And I think looking back at it, my mom always seemed to be that type of person where it was like all or nothing. You want to stand out and, make a difference and stand up for your beliefs. She was a bit of an extremist, um, and that was just that. It was just one of those things that was ingrained to me even before I started school, weeks prior, that we were going to sit down and make sure that everything went accordingly, so that there was no hiccups, and that it seemed like this was something that meant a lot to me that young, when in actuality it didn't. It was just something that was driven into my head.
Yeah. Wow. All right. So then how did things progress, at school or even, like in the Kingdom Hall? How were things going back then?
Well, so it's with school, the introduction to each following school year would continue with the same familiar routine, taking a stand for my beliefs in front of my new teacher. First thing before each and every school year, while being in the public school system. So this became something that I would start to avoid, if at all possible, eventually praying that my mom would just forget to prepare me for that first day of school.
Yeah.
And, as a Jehovah's Witness in school, I was obligated to not only share with my school teacher that I didn't celebrate any holidays, that, obviously includes birthdays, but explain to my new friends or acquaintances, as Jehovah's Witnesses, I was told not to call them friends. Yeah. So this didn't seem to cause any issue with my teachers, or schoolmates as well. But I remember distinctively in the second grade that kind of changing for me. So it changed for me in the sense that I became aware that when there was holiday events or it was somebody's birthday, I would be given extra work, or you go color in a different corner than where the activities were taking place, or oftentimes being physically segregated from, the other kids, so as not to see the fun that they were having at somebody's birthday. So this is when I really started to wonder why I couldn't be with my friends and basically having a vacation from the normal school day to, laugh and play and eat cake.
Yeah.
So, as a young kid, the only questions that I started thinking about was why I couldn't play with the other kids, and more importantly, why did they get cake and why couldn't I? So these things I remember my mother trying her best to explain to me as a 2-year-old, that ultimately the reason why I couldn't have cake is that it would upset God. So, in my mind, thinking back at that, it's like kids that young can't reason, or have the concept of faith. That, I was a parrot. I was only projecting what was driven into my mind, and I knew that it made my family happy, though.
Yeah. There in the Bible where it condemns cake.
Yeah, exactly.
It's just so silly. So then, how did things progress? How were you doing? So obviously, school is drama, really. I mean, it's not going to make you happy, because it's just a place where you have to confront all of these issues that aren't even your issue. They're your parents' issues, or the issues of a religion that they took on. What about, so, you're going to the Kingdom Hall as this young person, so what's that like? How is that impacting you?
Well, I would see that, at the earliest of ages, that my parents would take us to as much meetings as possible. They were never extremely regular, mind you, they were in their early 20s. My mom had me when she was 19 years old. So going through the school system, I remember my parents being the youngest people. So a lot of kids thought my parents were actually my older brother or sister. So going to meetings, obviously in their 20s, it was pretty inconsistent. It was hit and miss, but it was almost that they, preached, do as I say, not as I do, especially when it came to school. It's like, take this huge stand for your belief, but, we would be really hit and miss with meetings. And it really didn't make sense. But what I realized was that the Kingdom Hall was a place where I actually could have some friends, but these weren't by choice. Naturally, they were just kind of almost arranged friendships because these were acceptable kids to associate with outside of anything else that you knew. So so the early days of being a kid in that organization, I was, I don't know, 6 and 7 when my parents were already making me sit down and do the check marks, and pay attention in any form that I could, put a check mark by God or Jesus, or when we turn to the Bible, those things, if, something to just preoccupy a child. And I remember distinctively not wanting to, essentially do that. I would rather doodle or, draw or color. And, even at 6 or 7, that wasn't acceptable. I remember being yanked by my arm outside and getting spanked because I wasn't paying attention. And apparently paying attention meant that I would have to be, like I said, when Jesus was announced from the stage, or Jehovah, I'd make check marks, and that was what I was supposed to be doing, not coloring. So I'd get I'd get spankings. I'd get in trouble if I wasn't doing those things.
Isn't it amazing the pressure that is put on kids to live up to something? It's kind of like you brought out, here you were having to go to school and confront all of these things, and yet your parents weren't even regular at the meetings.
No.
You were taking more of a stand as a child than they were, and of course your mom never even grew up in it, so she has no idea. Much like
Right.
Same with my parents, they didn't grow up in it, so they had no idea what they were sending me to do every day. They had no concept of the stand I was being forced to take for them. Right. And I don't know that they would have taken that stand. I don't know if they would, you'd have to put them in that position, but
right.
Of course, my parents were very regular and very militant, but
sure.
But it is funny just to see or no, it's not funny. It's sad to see the pressure put on these young kids.
Mm-hmm.
So you're in the Kingdom Hall. You're starting to be indoctrinated, really. By just having to pay attention, and they're already kind of showing you, that it's works. This is a religion of works. It's all about sitting there and making a check mark when they say a word or something like that. It's not
right.
It's not about who you are. It's more about what you do. So then what was it, at home? You had said that before school, your parents were, stressed out and fighting and establishing businesses and getting involved in this cult that required a lot out of them. So how did that kind of progress at home, as you started getting into your, started getting a little older, around 10, started going into your teenage years on into young adulthood? What was that progression at home like?
Well, it was really extremely hectic because my parents were still fighting for full custody. This was a battle that took a long time, actually. And on top of them trying to establish my father's business, they were dealing with the court system, and they're also, like you said, programmed to believe that they were absolutely required to make as many of these meetings as possible, be out in the field ministry as well. And this is something that is almost like a full-time job within itself, let alone raising 3 children, because my parents ended up having another brother that's 5 years younger than me. So now it's me, my brother, and my sister living in this house. And it was, my childhood wasn't extremely horrible by any stretch, but it was just, maybe it was, I don't know, but it didn't seem like that.
Yeah.
But there was a lot of arguing, verbal abuse. And it was just, being home was, oftentimes it was the best thing ever or the worst thing ever. It was never a real medium. It was just up or down, and it was dependent on the mood of my parents that day.
I understand. I feel you there.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So then, that was kind of volatile. How were you were you making any progress, as the years went by in the religion? You know, how did you, progress to baptism, or, what was that process like for you?
Well, I wouldn't be baptized till I was about 17. So backing up, going through the, motions as a child, I only, in my mind, did as much as my parents. Like I said, it was something where, Jehovah's Witness parents kind of lived by do as I say, not as I do. And my parents, like I said, were never really regular growing up. And it was something in my mind that I said, well, I'm only going to try as hard as you. So meetings and stuff like that were just formalities for me. It was just something that was required of me. So it was never anything that I really took to heart, or anything that I really dove deep into wanting to understand, because it was just a little too difficult for me to understand some of the the rules and regulations, even at the youngest of ages. I didn't understand why, even playing outside, let alone kids from school. I remember, about to be in middle school, still in elementary school, fifth grade, having, friends say, "Hey, can I come over?" And they would come out with me to my parents' car, as kids do, to just kind of sway their parents' decision. And I would have my buddy by me, and I'd be like, can so and so come over? And they would say, my mom would say, "No, not today, DJ, not today." And that was always something that was, I'd try over and over again. And, once I would get home, I would ask my mom, like, "So why couldn't so and so come over?" And I was just told yet again that, as one of Jehovah's Witnesses, that God did not approve of that type of association, being that they were worldly. So I didn't fully understand exactly what it was that made them so unworthy of my friendship. And so I was slightly confused, to say the least. But after the following day or the weekend would pass, after, asking if that friend would come over, my buddy would come up and ask, "Why can't I come over?" Or, "If I can't come to your house, do you think you could come over to mine?" And I knew in my mind that if my parents weren't going to allow a worldly person to come over to my house, that there wasn't a chance in hell that I'd be able to go to theirs. And this would affect my relationships with kids at school, because, I would just imagine their parents were aware of their child wanting to hang out with me, or vice versa. And, just being told, me relaying that information to my buddy of why they couldn't, explaining to them that they weren't a Jehovah's Witness and that they didn't believe the same things that my parents did, and that was unacceptable. I could just imagine them going back home and telling their parents that, and how offended they must have been, and probably told their kids, like, "How about you avoid that person?"
Yeah, it's very arrogant.
Yeah, it is. And growing up, I would just get to see more and more how Jehovah's Witnesses are very entitled, and they feel superior. So that was something that was starting to get ingrained into my mindset, was like, people just weren't acceptable. They were just cogs in the world, somebody that was there, but not really.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So then, did you, as you were growing up, did you, it doesn't sound like your parents were probably the type, did they ever like auxiliary pioneer or anything? Did you ever get, drugged through those processes?
That wouldn't happen till my mom would reach her mid 30s, I think. So my dad growing up was never the spiritual head, and to this day never has been. Yeah. So he was always just somebody who, which is so interesting, because he was the Jehovah's Witness before, my mother.
Yeah.
Growing up, he knew exactly what it was that you were supposed to do to climb up the ladder. And my dad, from what he said in some deep conversations that I had with him as I would, start to drift away, was that it was never something that he did either, but he knew it as the truth. So in his mind, that was good enough. And that was not the case with my mom. She always wanted him to be the spiritual head, and pushing for, family study and taking us out in the field ministry. And it was like pulling teeth with my dad, as as much as it was for the kids to get ready for meeting or service. And my mom was always that driving force, that person that was really the one that got us going. So, like I said, my mom or dad didn't really do anything in the truth as far as like extracurricular until my mom was in her, mid 30s, and she would start to auxiliary and start going out in service more and stuff like that.
And so then how old would you have been then? Were you pushed into that as well, or were you old enough to maybe not have to go along with everything?
Yeah. So at this time, I'll jump to a little back again where,
Sure.
yeah. So, this was, I don't know, I had to have been 13 or so. But anyways, right before I started middle school. So my sister became increasingly more and more into boys, as normal teens, girls do.
Sure.
And I remember on this one specific occasion, I was just graduating like elementary school, going into middle school, and my parents said that I could have 5 of my friends within the organization go to Magic Mountain. They were going to take me to Magic Mountain. So they did a sleepover at my house. All the kids were over. And the next morning, my dad was coming home with, our dog. He had taken the dog to the vet the day before. And he said that once he came back from the vet that morning, he was going to pick up the dog. And once he came back to drop off the dog, to be out front and ready to go so that he can just kind of pick us up. So me and my buddies are all outside, playing, skateboarding, and just doing whatever out front, waiting for my dad to come home. And it was like 8 a.m. or something like that. And as soon as he pulls up, he gets the dog, jumps out of the truck, and he left the truck running, and we're all still playing in the front yard. And when my dad was taking the dog inside, a guy ran along the side of our house that was just waiting there, jumped in my dad's truck and virtually stole it right in front of us kids. And we were like, wait, we thought it was a joke. I thought maybe it was a neighbor or somebody that my dad knew. I was just so confused. And he ends up going into the cul-de-sac and realizing it was a dead end and turning and hitting curbs and cars and just messing up the truck. And long story short, he ends up being chased by one of my neighbors and my dad in a car, and my neighbor was on a dirt bike, and they ended up catching the guy. And in my mind, I was like, oh my gosh, that was so crazy. My dad's brand new truck that he had just gotten was totaled. I was like, I had my friends there, and I was young enough to be like, well, this sucks. Like, I mean, it sucks for my parents that they had to do that. But for me, in my mind, I was like, well, it sucks even more that now I can't go to Magic Mountain with my friends. And my dad is, cool as he was like, no, absolutely not. Like, that's what insurance is for.
Really?
He handled it with the cops. Yeah. And he ended up taking me to Magic Mountain with all of my friends.
Wow, that's nice.
Yeah. So it was cool. It was a crazy start to the day, to say the least. And so when we're at Magic Mountain, we're having a great time. And I remember distinctively my dad getting a phone call, and he did not look happy. He just looked shocked. He was just like, wow. And I was just like, what was, he pulled me aside. I was like, is something about the truck or what? And he's like, we're going to have to, wrap this up soon, DJ. And it was maybe like 2 or 3 in the afternoon. It was, we still had a couple of hours at the theme park in my mind, but now it was being cut short. But I was just happy that we got to go regardless. Yeah. So on the way home, I was thinking, oh, the kids are going to come back to my house. And my dad's like, no, we're going to have to drop them all off. We have something to attend to at home. And what I would later find out once we got home is that as my sister was getting more and more into boys, apparently while my mom was gone at work, she was watching my little brother at home. And she had been talking to a boy up the street. And apparently when she and my brother were there, that boy that she had liked and had been talking to came over, and my mom found out. And they didn't do anything. They were just, they were young. My sister was 16 at the time. And he came over and hung out, and my mom found out, and boy, was that a scene. It was, and it was clearly evident growing up that my mom treated her different than my sister different than me and my brother. And I think that she harbored harsh feelings towards my sister because she was technically not her child,
Yeah.
and that she helped fight for essentially and raise this girl. And it wasn't an easy process. And my dad treated her differently, my sister as well differently, but never in a way that made me or my brother feel jealous, like she got special treatment or anything. But it was evident in my mind that was my dad's only daughter, and you can tell how much he just loved her.
Yeah.
But I think over the years, my mom grew to, increasingly jealous of this and couldn't wait for my sister, to mess up. So once my mom found out, she just lost her mind, and she came into the house and was screaming at my sister, throwing stuff at her, hitting her, and calling her all kinds of names like, "You whore, you're gonna end up just like your mom." And that was just like and this wasn't anything out of the ordinary for me. This was just another time that my mom was upset, because this is how she treated us kids that young. When she was upset, there'd be a lot of name calling, there'd be physical abuse, and so my sister at this point had enough of it. At 16 years old, she realized, because growing up to this point, this was just how things were handled in my house. My dad was never physically abusive. I don't think he's ever raised a hand to me or any of my siblings. And if he did, it's erased from my mind, because it was nothing in comparison to how our mother, handled disciplinary action. So once my sister went through this with my mom for the last time, she was fed up, and she actually ended up running away. And that would be the last time that my sister would live with us, and that I would see her for years, because she ultimately went to move back in with her mom and wanted nothing to do with the organization or coming back home.
Wow. That's pretty harsh. That's a hard, it's a hard situation for you, to watch your sister leave. And
Yeah.
I mean, it was hard on your parents too, I'm sure.
Yeah, it was definitely hard on the family on multiple levels. But I knew for me it was hard because my sister at the time was essentially my best friend.
Yeah.
We were only 2 years apart, and this was somebody I could be 100% myself around when my parents or other family was around to to uphold us to our witness beliefs and standards. It almost seemed like an unspoken bond that we had of sharing mixed emotions about our faith, being so young. But we're essentially each other's confidants. So
Yeah.
for her to just be uprooted that one day, it was such an extreme day already on so many levels. And then that was like the catalyst. It just stood out in my mind as like, it was just extreme circumstances. And it was really sad that would be her last time, ever coming back home, or me getting home from school and her being there. That was the end of that.
Wow. Yeah, that's hard. Hard. I'm sure it was really hard, on her to leave as well. It's just, I mean, I'm sure, in her mind in the moment, it was just, I've got to get away from crazy. But
absolutely.
Yeah, that's tough.
And I think she knew her options too, because growing up, like I said, there was a lot of abuse in the family, and she saw that my parents were having this, two-faced approach at raising their family in this organization, where at home, like on paper, our family looked like picture perfect, to the hall and the organization. But as soon as we were back home, that's when the dragon was released if any of us fell out of line and we didn't do what we were told. And I think my sister knew her options at that time, which was that she had, her real mom that wasn't a Jehovah's Witness, that was encouraging her to come live with her and get out of that environment. And she took her mom up on that, and I couldn't blame her.
No,
even to this day, I honestly to this day wished I had the balls or the opportunity to do something that, like that myself at that age. But I just remember thinking, I wish I could have left too.
Sure.
But good for you. Just keep running.
That's funny. it just kind of brought up, for me as a kid, I can remember, I always wanted to run away.
Right.
I had nowhere to
Right.
go to, but man, did I want to run away. If I would sit there and try to make plans, where could I go? I know where my grandparents live. I could go there, but that's not going to go over well.
Yeah.
And that's a long, it was, like a 20-mile walk, but,
Right.
but as a kid, you have no concept of some of that. But I think that I wonder how many kids there are out there that, were born and raised Jehovah's Witnesses, where they just felt so out of control, and they just wanted a break. They just wanted to get away, to go somewhere. And I'm sure that those feelings are felt and shared by a lot of people.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point, because I mean, even at that age, I remember distinctively that's when it would start in my mind that, man, I wish I could leave this. I don't want this either. It's causing us so much, personal pain. And I just didn't understand why there was, so much hypocrisy or double standards, even at that age. And in my mind, that's when it would start. Like, there was a little seed that was planted at that point, where in my mind, I started questioning more and more, and started to do less and less of what my mother was requiring of me. And that really started in middle school. I started to act differently. And as a Jehovah's Witness, you're not supposed to dress a certain way, but yeah. I was like really into skateboarding. So I dressed like a skater, and being told that I couldn't wear, a belt because it had studs on it, or, something as dumb as that. So I remember rolling up my belt and put it in my backpack. And once I got to school, I'd put it on, and my sister would do this too. She would take clothes that she would want to wear, like a tube top or whatever was in style in, the late 90s. But we would essentially dress a certain way before school just to change into what we felt more comfortable in. And we weren't supposed to dress that way, but I wanted to make my friends, I wanted to fit in, essentially. And I basically started living somewhat of a double lifestyle at, I don't know, 13 years old. Yeah. And this would really be the time that I would start questioning my beliefs and justifying some of my actions that went against my family's beliefs. And my mom would soon start to see that pattern and behavior, and it was an obvious change. And she thought that my dealings with the kids there were worldly. It was a worldly influence, and it was a bit much. And she was right in that sense. I was definitely starting to change. And so I would only actually attend a year of middle school before being taken out to finish my education through an independent schooling system. So at this time, my mom said, it's just getting too much. And I started becoming really independent and not wanting to do what was asked of me. And so she wanted to take me out of school. And I was all for it, actually, because I thought to myself, when she approached me with wanting to take me out, I thought to myself, well, I can't live the lifestyle that I want in school. So it was too hard for me to be in school, because I wanted to do certain things. I wanted to hang out with certain people, go to their house, go skateboarding with them, but these things weren't allowed. So I was just like, well, what's the point? So yeah, I wanted to get out of school, because in my mind I was thinking, well, I'll just get all my work done and have the rest of the day to do what interests me, Yeah. So I did a lot of what interests me, skateboarding and a lot of art. Once, I'd finished all of my schooling for that day, my mom would actually catch on to what I was doing, which was I'd wake up super early, get all of my work for that day done super early. And then the rest of the day, I would just kind of do whatever I wanted, skateboard, play video games. And I started to absolutely love it. And
yeah, you were living the dream.
Yeah, I exactly. I felt like for once in my life, I got some semblance of freedom. Now I have my time. And, I viewed it that way because my mom had started to go to work, because my dad's business was starting to fail. And so no one was really home to micromanage me anymore during the day. And I absolutely loved it. And, my mom eventually caught on to what I was doing, and she thought I had too much free time on my hands. So she then advised me that I needed to make a schedule to go out in the ministry more so that I could, quote unquote, spend my time more wisely. So
there goes the dream.
Yeah. So that was pretty short lived. And that's when I would actually, for the first time, be introduced to more activities within the organization. So I was about 14, 15 when this happened. And so she said, I needed to start making a weekly schedule and ask some kids that I grew up with that were at this point doing really well spiritually, to ask them if I can go out and service with them, because they started pioneering. And these were kids that I grew up with in the organization, and they were the closest thing in my mind to the coolest kids that I knew that I could hang out with. So it wasn't the end of the world for me to start going out and service with them, because in my mind I was like, oh, well, we'll hang out. And these were kids. These were two brothers. They were a little over a year apart, and I believe one was baptized at 13 and the other one was at 14. So when I started hanging out with them, I was just like, oh wow, they're already baptized. And in my mind, I was like, there's no way I want to do that. And I just didn't really feel like hanging out with them all too much. But it seemed, because it just seemed like they're a little too gung ho on the truth. When kids that are baptized that young, typically their parents are holier than thou, and their children kind of do those things to appease their parents. And it was very evident to me that was the case. And
if you can see me, I'm raising my hand right now.
yeah, go ahead.
That's me.
Yeah. And this wasn't something that I faulted him for, because it was weird how my mindset started to change, and I really started to mature as far as the way I process things. And I became way more introspective when I started questioning things and looking at other people's scenarios, and not really faulting them for them, because they were so young that they weren't even thinking about these things. They were just going through the motions to make their parents happy. And I could see right through it at the youngest of ages, and that they weren't really doing it for themselves, even if they said they did. But it was completely obvious how much praise and respect that they got from the older ones, their parents, and most of the time, even other kids, for being driven spiritually at such a young age. But these two brothers that I had played with earlier in childhood, they were at the time the most interesting kids that I could associate with in the organization. So I would start going out in the ministry with them a couple times during the week after my schooling, just so that my mom would stay off my case.
So then how do we get from this period of time? So you're, 14, 15.
Yeah.
And then I think you said you were you got baptized at 17.
Right.
So how do you go from, the kid that is kind of on the outs, that is perceptive enough to see that, these other kids that got baptized super young and weren't really as sincere as it appeared. What was the transition that got you from, in those next couple years to the point of being baptized?
Well, like I said, I was being homeschooled and going out in the field ministry door to door, more and more often with these kids that were pioneering. So this was something that kind of grew on me, because I really did start to enjoy their association as far as the friendship that we started to cultivate.
Gotcha.
And it wasn't necessarily about the truth or enjoying the field ministry. That would kind of start to happen, where I was like, oh, well, this isn't the worst, because I'm surrounded by my friends and we're having a good time.
Right.
But what would really be the catalyst of me pushing to get baptized was they had those two brothers that I mentioned that I would start to associate with into my teen years. They had a cousin, and she was my age, and she would come to visit all the time. And me and her started to have an interest in each other, about 16 years old. And essentially, to make a long story short, we would start to, in so many words, date.
Yeah.
even though we weren't supposed to talk. People were kind of privy to the fact that we were texting and stuff like that. So once it got to the point where I wanted to be able to date this person, she had already been baptized. The kids that I was associating were already baptized. And I can see a difference, or, a mindset change in all of the kids that I started to associate with and their parents, where at 16 years old, they're like, well, he's definitely old enough to get baptized. And you're talking to my daughter, but you're not spiritually strong. So by me getting baptized, it was 100% because I felt the ramifications, the negative ramifications of being the outskirt guy that wasn't baptized. And more importantly, I wanted to impress this girl's parents and let them know, like, I'm taking this serious.
Wait, are you telling me that some people get baptized not out of a dedication to the Most High, but out of just a desire to please other people, or because undue influence was it was put upon them, or
100%?
I wonder how many kids that get baptized have any real, like, I don't know, this. I guess the dedication that we were told we were supposed to have was kind of romanticized.
Right.
But, I think most of us did it because we knew at a certain point we had to, whether it was to please our parents or to date some boy or girl, or to just fit in with our friends or not be looked down upon in the congregation.
Yep.
Yeah, I think
Absolutely.
That's what most of it is.
Yeah. And I mean, at that age too, when I was this age, I was 17 when I got baptized, but really I started being pushed at 16 to do it. And I didn't want to. I knew in my mind I didn't want to, because I knew how important it was. And by important, I mean important to everyone else.
Yeah.
But it had to make sense to me. And at the time, the truth really didn't make sense to me, because there was a lot of things in my mind that I just couldn't get over. I was very privy to the hypocrisy with other families and the congregation. And like I said, I saw right through kids getting baptized at that young of an age. And I was just like, they're not doing it for the right reasons. If I'm going to get baptized, I'm going to do it on my own accord, because it makes sense to me, because that's what baptism should be, right?
Right.
Is your personal dedication to Jehovah. But little did I know that dedication is actually to the Watchtower the organization, not God himself. So, essentially I got baptized because I wanted to ultimately please my parents, make them look good, prove to the girl that I was talking to that I was serious, and her parents and everyone around me, that their association would stop dwindling with me because I wasn't taking that stand for my faith.
Yeah, that's a tough period of life, because you're taking such an inauthentic step that has such huge ramifications
Right.
later in life. So then how did this play out? So you get baptized, you've got this girl. How do things do things change after that?
Yeah. So at this time, so my mom, my mom and dad were pretty big drinkers growing up. And like I said, they were young parents. So they still partied a lot. They had their friends and they would go to barbecues and get all sauced up. And I would see this all the time. My parents would get in huge fights because someone said this, and all the gossip, and they're all, drinking and getting drunk and arguing about the dumbest things.
Wait, are you talking about Jehovah's Witnesses?
Yeah, the ones that tell you how to live your life, yet they don't do it themselves.
Right.
And I saw this happening, and like I said, my parents were, pretty heavy drinkers, especially by witness standards, and my mom especially. And now at this time in my life, 16 years old, 17 years old, my mom had, like I said, went to work a couple of years prior to that, and she got into real estate because my dad's business failed. So they ended up declaring bankruptcy on that business. my dad was starting up another one. And so this was a really stressful time for my family yet again. And my mom started doing real estate, and she ended up actually becoming really, really successful and becoming the breadwinner by far at this point in my life. But along with that stress for her came even more and more drinking. So at the age of 16 years old, my mom was just a full like raging alcoholic, to where it was so bad that she ended up going to rehab for almost a year. And at this time I was thinking about my career choice, and the friends those two boys that that I was hanging out with at the time, their dad had become a firefighter. So I was trying to just busy myself and get away from home as much as possible, because it was super hectic. I'm in getting to be 17 years old, and I'm just seeing that I don't want to be at home because it's just so broken right now. My mom's constantly drinking, no one was in a good place at home. And on a stark contrast, my friends' parents, they were great people. Everything seemed happy-go-lucky. And I would just, basically force an indoctrination upon myself to busy myself. So the ministry became just busy work for me. But also because their dad was a firefighter, I was thinking about my career choice. And I was like, well, he's a firefighter and he's a ministerial servant. He can do it. So I ended up with my two friends, his sons, becoming firefighter explorers. And while my mom was in rehab, that's how I just consumed my mind, was going into this fire academy with these kids. And it was basically like military camp. So I think in the back of my mind, it was a sense of structure. It was a sense of discipline, and it just kept me preoccupied. So I did as much busy work as possible, just so as not to feel the ramifications of the emotions that I was going through at that time.
Gotcha. Yeah, keep busy so that you can keep distracted from everything going on.
Yeah.
I'm sorry to hear that about your mom. That's tough.
Yeah. You know what? Looking back at it, it didn't surprise me with the way that my mom raised us, that she would ultimately break down, and get to such a low point where it would require intervention. And ultimately, like I said, she was gone for a good portion of the year outside of our town in the LA area, going through a rehab. And just to find out that after I graduated from that fire academy, that while she was in rehab, she had started smoking, and her mindset changed about the organization. And she didn't want to come back to live. Like I said, my mom became very successful. And so my parents had multiple homes, and they had just built like a 4,000 square foot home. And this was all weighing on my dad now, who had his own business, but it wasn't generating the type of income that my mom was. But they were basically living off of what my mom's savings had accumulated to.
Yeah.
And also selling off properties to sustain that lifestyle while she was away. So this was weighing heavily on my dad. My brother was so young at the time, he didn't know what was going on. And for me, I could see right through it that, when my mom was away, her mindset changed. She would send me letters, and I would just toss them. I would throw them away because I was just so upset with her. And I didn't want to talk to her. I didn't talk to her the whole time that she was gone. And and I found out through my dad that she had started smoking cigarettes, and that she told my dad that she didn't want to come back home, that she was going to go into sober living with some people that obviously weren't Jehovah's Witnesses, and by far, the worst association if you're Jehovah's Witness to consider addicts living together. And so my mom getting out of rehab, my dad was saying, you got to come back. So she ended up my dad ended up telling her, like, you can't do this to our family. You have to come back and, help raise the children and take care of responsibilities. And she basically gave him an ultimatum saying, well, if we're going to make this work, then I don't want to move back to the city that they were living in, and she wanted to live by the beach. So my mom ended up getting a place out here, and where I currently live, and it's right by the beach, and it was a place that we grew up coming to, as kids, and ultimately in her mind it made her happy, and she just needed a fresh start. So mind you, I'm still living in Palmdale. My parents have this huge house and multiple properties, and they've moved out here now, and I'm still kind of in the fire academy and doing things out there, and I didn't really want to move. This was home to me.
Right.
So a lot of the times I just stayed with my friend's family that I was going out in service with all the time, because that to me was a stable environment. Looking back at it, I would rather be there instead of deal with all the ups and downs of what my parents were going through. And ultimately they would be out here living, and I would have that huge house to myself. And it was so lonely that I would just go back to my friend's house, But after that, my parents were forced to sell the home just because they ran out of savings. And that would be ultimately the time that I would move out to, towards the beach area with my parents for, like 2 years or so.
So I hate, I don't want to digress too much, but I have to ask, I don't want to take the focus off of you, but so your mom, so she starts doubting things that she believed were the truth because she got away from it.
Exactly.
In this rehab, which is something that as soon as you said that, my ears perked up, because that I have found over and over with people that if they can just get away from the indoctrination, for some reason, for my wife and I, it was because we owed a bunch of money in taxes and we had to work all the time to pay off this huge debt that we owed. And so it was that time away where we were like, wait a minute, this doesn't all add up. It's like your brain can finally process this stuff you've been brainwashed with. So in this case, it was actually an alcohol and drug rehab that helped her to start waking up. But what was her path? Did she continue? Did she go back to quote the truth? Did she go back to the witnesses, or did she kind of fade away? Or
see, this is where the story gets interesting, is because now, like you said, I firmly believe that being my case too, is once you take a step back, you're able to think for yourself. You start to reevaluate scenarios and doctrine, and you're able to critically think on these topics. And I think what was happening with my mom while she was in rehab was she's meeting people from all over with all types of belief systems and ideas, and they're testing hers. And I think what she finally felt for the first time was that certain things that she was doing were ultimately not making her happy. And that could have very well been the case of why she was in the place that she was in.
Absolutely.
So, after she got out of, rehab, and my parents, made their amends and came together to live by the beach, there would be a period of, a little over a year where my mom was really stagnant. She was really working on her sobriety. She was, we're in a new hall out here by the beach, and she didn't fully throw herself back in, but just little tidbits and hit or miss kind of again, but as regular as possible. But once she realized that she had to get a better grasp on her sobriety, like most addicts, they throw themselves wholeheartedly into something else. And she went straight into full-time pioneering after that.
Oh, man.
and to this day, she's been a full-time pioneer for 11 years, I want to say now.
Which just goes to show that a lot of religious zealotry, a lot of that is just addiction. I mean, there's you can be addicted to a religion or an ideology and throw yourself into that just like you can any substance. It's a great way to escape. And Jehovah's Witnesses have built their own entire other alternate reality to escape into. So,
yeah, absolutely. No, I believe that wholeheartedly. That that is the case. I mean, it's not only with Jehovah's Witnesses, that's with anybody with an addiction.
Yeah.
You quit alcohol, you got to fill that need, that constant want with something else, whether that's cigarettes, that's energy drinks, coffee. It's one thing, you replace one thing with another.
Yeah.
And justify why it's better than what you were doing.
Yep, absolutely. Well, I'm sorry to hear that's the path she ended up taking. I was hoping there was a certain freedom story there as well.
Yeah, I wish.
Yeah. That pull is pretty strong though. Back to that, the indoctrination and
right.
And I mean, they just have so much to keep you busy and so much so that you don't have to think. Well, so then back to your story. Where did you go from there? You're living with this other family kind of, and then you end up moving to the beach with your family again. How do things progress from there?
So from there, I'm still talking to that original girl, that my friends had introduced me to. It was their cousin, and it wasn't the worst thing for me to move back out here, and she helped me to understand that, the girl that I was talking to, which we would later start to date. And this would be actually the time that we would, because she would, tell me, maybe it's not such a bad thing because the beach is great. And I was like, yeah, that is true. And she lived relatively close to where I would be living. It was only maybe a 30-minute drive as opposed to an hour and a half of where she lived when I lived, in the desert.
Right.
So when I moved to the beach, it was now a shorter distance to see each other. And I was just like, well, okay, that makes sense. And that, I was still talking to her at the time. I moved in with my parents and, started to get used to the congregation out here. And boy, was that a change. There was a stark contrast, a difference between the congregation that I essentially was born and raised in for 16 years of my life at one congregation, which I just came to know. It had it had like virtually 200 publishers in it, and when we moved out here to the beach, it was a small congregation that had 64.
Wow.
And so that was a big change, and getting used to the demographic. They were all older individuals, nobody my age. And so I would try my best, and be regular just as much as my parents were, because I was living in their same, under the same house as them. But at this time, my mom started to see the closeness that I would, start to have with this girl. And, she would later start to like really try to catch me doing something wrong, cause she knew I was texting her, and she was always curious about what it was. And, she would like check my phone and text messages and stuff like that. And I remember specifically, this girl ended up sending me, so I guess you can say somewhat lewd pictures, and my mom found them. And she would then convince me that this girl was not somebody I needed to be talking to, that it was her fault essentially. So I pretty much sabotaged that relationship with that girl, essentially because my mom wanted me to have nothing to do with her. And it was just kind of a weird, devastating point in my life.
Yeah. I don't know what you do with that. That's tough. Your first relationship, and so many witness parents end up being, they don't trust their kids, and they end up spying on them with keyloggers on their computers, or going through their phones, or going through their rooms. My mom did a lot of that stuff. It's really sad, the lack of trust that's there. So, you're not only losing your girlfriend here, but you've got this weird dynamic with your mom too, where she's influencing you in that way and going through your stuff.
And it was at a weird age too, because now I'm 17 years old.
Yeah, I
have my own job. I'm at the time I was working at Target, and I absolutely hated it. But in my mind, I was like, I'm starting to become a grown man and have my own. I bought a car and had a job and was doing essentially independent things, yet still being very micromanaged. And the reason was because I was living under their roof. And my mom said, as long as you're living under our roof, you will do exactly as you're told. And, essentially dictating how things were going to be to the nth degree. So I at that point in time, when I ended up breaking things off with this girl, and I saw how rigid my mom was on certain things, but very lax on others, especially with herself, I really started to think like, okay, well, if I'm being manipulated in this organization, then I'm going to start to manipulate the situation. And that at that point, at 17 years old, I made basically a pact with myself that I was going to start looking out for me and only me, and start to do things for myself that were unbeknownst to my parents, to make progress, to get out from underneath them and do my own thing. So I only worked at Target for a couple of months, and then I got introduced to a brother in the local area, and I was invited to come to a barbecue. And at that barbecue, he got to know me. We're all sitting in the spa, and this guy is in his, he's maybe 31 years old, and we go up to his house, and it was a bunch of younger kids and a little older mix as well, but they were all really cool people. They were all into surfing and skating, all the stuff that I loved, and we're hanging out, and we're at his house, and it was a really nice house. And I asked him what he did, and he said he did pools. And he asked me what I did, and I said I worked at Target, and kind of shied away from letting him know what I did, because I wasn't too proud of it. Everybody needs a job, but in my mind I didn't want that one. So he's like, well, you're gonna do that forever? And I didn't really know how to take that at first, but I said no, I gotta make money somehow. And right there on the spot, he offered me a job, and I took him up on the offer. And so I shadowed him for about a month, to learn, the ins and outs of the industry and being a service tech. And basically a month after that, he gave me 60 accounts to manage on my own. So I went from making virtually minimum wage to, almost $4,000 a month at 17 years old.
Nice.
So yeah. So and that to me was just, like I said, at that age, before this had all happened, I had made that pact in my mind that I was going to look out for myself. I was going to be independent and start making decisions for myself. And when I started making that type of money, it really just went straight to my head. Like, I just wanted to get out of my parents' house as quickly as possible. So once my mom was privy to the amount of money that I was making at that age and at the time, my parents didn't need the money, but she would say, well, you're gonna start paying rent. Mm-hmm. And in my mind, I was thinking, like, I just started making good money. Like, why can't I just save this? I'm doing everything that you're asking of me. And maybe that was a little selfish on my end. And, she was telling me that it's part of responsibility. And I totally understand that. But, I couldn't go to college. I couldn't do this or that. So I just thought, why can't I just save this little nest egg or something like that and apply it to my future? But
yeah, and it kind of sucks too that, the first time you start to rise above, the first time you start to rise up, somebody has to be, standing there with their hand out, especially right. Your own parents being like, hey, you're finally, you're starting to get ahead in this game. Where's my piece?
Yes.
It's just, It doesn't feel good.
No, it doesn't. And I, especially knowing my parents' case so intimately is because my parents were still living off of savings from my mom, and it was dwindling. And I knew that. So in my mind, I just thought, well, are they just siphoning a little off the top from me because it would help them out? Sure. Am I upset about that? Kinda, because I realized that, technically I'm still not of age, and they're requiring me to pay rent because I'm making good money. I didn't really fully comprehend that or agree with it, but I did it regardless.
Sure.
But only for a limited amount of time before I would realize that I had to make a change to get out. And the only way that I saw that was by moving out. So I started hanging out with people more and more, coming home less and less. And that's when I would ultimately meet what would become my wife at like a gathering with some Jehovah's Witnesses. And that's when the story, even gets more interesting, is when I met this woman. I was 18 years old now. And almost immediately we started talking and dating. So we dated for 6 months, and then we were engaged for 6 months before we got married.
Okay.
So, and at that time I was just making those steps to become more and more independent. And I think that the way that the witnesses outline freedom and how you're supposed to do it as an individual is find a mate, get married, and start living your own life in this organization. And so that's essentially what I did. Is she at the time was spiritual. She was auxiliary pioneering. And I thought, perfect. This is a double whammy. She's gorgeous and she's very spiritual. It'll make my parents happy, because obviously the girl that I was interested in before didn't. And that kind of drove a wedge in between our relationship to the point where I had to stop because it was just too much to bear, and deal with. So with this girl, it was perfect because, she was adored by many.
Yeah, that would definitely help. In contrast to the circumstances with the other girl, with your mom. I'm sure she was happy that you found this other sister who was, as you said, adored by many. So then,
right.
So you guys get married and life is happily ever after, right?
I wish that was the case. Yeah. So we ended up getting married. It was a really beautiful wedding, actually. And, a lot of the brothers and sisters came together to help us out. It was on a ranch of some friends of the family that had a really nice home. And there ended up being like almost 400 people at our wedding. And it was beautiful. It was great. And that was the first time I had really seen the unity within the Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, they really do come together. And now that I come to think of it, it was almost more so a reason to come together and party, because there were so many elders, pioneers, really faithful people at our wedding that, looking back at the wedding video, they were all completely sauced, and I was very appreciative that they helped us out in so many ways with getting preparing for the wedding.
Right.
But essentially it's like the one and only time witnesses can kind of get unruly and out of hand. So
yes,
they look forward to it as much as anybody else.
Yes, when you only have one thing to celebrate in life,
right?
Which is a wedding. I mean, what else do witnesses celebrate? There isn't much. So yeah. So that's your time to show out.
Right. Yeah. And so at the wedding, I vowed to dedicate myself to this woman, and I absolutely meant it. But I don't think she fully understood, and I wasn't ready to divulge how I truly felt about things spiritually. And, I was doing everything by the books, as closely as possible, and proving to people that I was good association and I was doing my best while still maintaining a full-time job. And I, more importantly, wanted to provide for this woman. I wanted to give her anything that she would ever want, because that's just what I wanted to do. I wanted to give to somebody. And, but she didn't fully understand me, and I didn't fully understand her. Like, we had basically only known each other for a year.
Yeah. And
before we decided to dedicate ourselves to each other. So, and we were so young and naive. But regardless, we tried, our best to make it work. And the first couple of years, obviously for any marriage, it's going to have its highs and lows, its ups and downs. But we did do our best. And, there was a lot of good times that came out of trying to figure out and navigate spirituality with another person. And this was the early days when I would start to just kind of throw tidbits of questions and, what do you think about this, through research and this or that. And my wife at the time was somebody who was very reserved with her beliefs. Like she would say, well, this is how I feel. That's that. Like there's no real sway. Like even if I don't understand it, it's just what we do. And to me, I wouldn't really speak out about it because I didn't want to offend her or anybody to get an idea that I might be questioning things. So I internalized everything and kept everything to myself for the good majority of the years that we were married. So, it was a real interesting time to say the least.
Yeah, that's a heck of a strain on a marriage when you have this giant thing between you, this religion that isn't just part of your life, but is your life. It is your identity. And then, you don't necessarily fully believe, and your partner clearly fully believed.
Right.
She was all in. So even if she didn't understand, which is the case with a lot of witnesses. I think a lot of them don't really even know what they believe. They just know that that's what they're supposed to believe.
Absolutely. And that was something that I had to come to terms with for myself. And I could only imagine that anybody that can think introspectively or is concerned about their own well-being would eventually come to that conclusion of starting to question things, whether it's good or bad. It's going to eventually lead to, the process of evaluating or reevaluating your situation. And what I noticed even with my wife is that even, being approached with the slightest of questioning, they write it off like, well, we might not know this, but that's okay because we don't have to. We just do the fundamentals and that's good enough. And, I might not be happy or understand it now, but we will when the new scrolls come out or in the new system, everything will be okay. And it's like, no, that's just not how my mind worked. And it would evidently become more and more, increasingly obvious that those answers weren't good enough for me. And so, like I said, I was doing pools at the time. I was working for somebody else, kind of as like a subcontractor now. Mm-hmm. And that guy that initially gave me the job, he ended up retiring, in his like mid 30s, and moving out of state. And I told him when I had started working for him, if there was if he decided to sell his business, to give me first dibs at it. And I don't know what I was thinking. I didn't have the money set aside for that. Now I was married. I had responsibilities and priorities. I didn't have the savings that I could, pay for the business or get a loan or whatever. I was still really young. But when he decided to retire and move away, he took into consideration how hard I worked for him, and he approached me and said that he would sell me a portion of his business. And I said, well, I would love to do that, man, but I don't have the funds. I'm not gonna get a loan. Like it doesn't make sense for me right now. And he actually allowed me over time to pay it off. So what I did was I cut him a check every month, which was quite substantial for almost 2 years. Sure. Until I paid it off, and then I owned it outright. So that's how I ended up acquiring, my own business out of that.
Wow. He sure did you right, because that could have gone a lot worse.
It absolutely. And I still thank him to this day, and he really did me a favor, because I never ended up finishing high school, because at 17 years old, like I said, I was still doing the independent study program and going through the process of school, and they kept, I had transferred, 3 different schools between where I used to live and to the beach, and then at the beach, another school, and they kept messing up on my credits. And I was making good money at the time. And I just thought to myself, these people aren't even doing their job. This is time out of my day. I'm working full time. I'm running, essentially a business in high school, and these people don't know how to do their job. I'm not going to redo this work. And it was just a waste of my time. So in my mind, I thought, I don't need a piece of paper to tell me who I am or who I'm going to become. And I was kind of strong-headed about it, but I ended up walking away and just diving into my business. And in the end, it was for the better, in my opinion. So.
Oh, sure. It would have been easy to be disillusioned when you seem to be doing better than the people who are in charge of this education that are struggling to get things, the basic things straight with your credits.
Right. Yeah, it was a little difficult for me to understand that, and maybe that's just a sign of where the school system's at, but I saw right through it too. And I just was like, this, honestly, this is, in my personal opinion, at a certain point, high school just becomes more social, and there was no social aspect of school for me at all. So I was like, man, this makes zero sense for me. I just need to focus on myself.
Yeah. So then, so now you're married and you've got this business, you've got it paid off. And you've also got these doubts.
Right.
So how does this end up progressing?
Well, the doubts started progressing more and more. They became increasingly worse and worse over the years. But I still internalized it because I knew how my wife would act. I knew how my parents would approach it. I could never have a debate with my father over doctrine because he himself didn't really ever dive into it to fully understand it. It was just something he did as well. And the times that I would have, debates are, talks with my mom about doctrine. She was extremely vague, and there was a lot that she didn't know either, and which was confusing because somebody who's a full-time pioneer, and she had been for some years at this time, you would think that she'd be able to uphold the truth and its doctrine to the slightest amount of scrutiny. And that just wasn't the case. So I kept getting the runaround, and I wasn't really expressing too much of what I was getting into with other people with my wife because I didn't want her to worry about it. I didn't want her to think that my faith was wavering in that sense. But I wanted answers. I wanted clarification because I got to a point where I was like, well, the Bible says to make the truth your own, and I never had that opportunity. So I'm kind of doing things in reverse. I'm going back to square one. I want answers, And so after a couple of people, I talked to a couple of elders about certain topics. My mom then referred me to my grandfather, my dad's dad, who had been an elder for 30 plus years now at this time. And we got into a lot of debates and some heated arguments, and it wasn't on my end. It was on the end of my grandfather being upset that I came across information that didn't coincide with the doctrine or the books or the publications that the organization produces. So if anybody does any outside research, that's considered apostate research, and it goes directly against the organization. And so my grandfather at a certain point said that he would have nothing to do with our discussions because of the fact that I was debating him with apostate research. And we were talking about the littlest things as far as the beginning of the religion. They
don't want to talk about that.
No, I went all the way back to the founder, talking about Charles Taze Russell and getting into his life before, all the way back into the late 1800s and asking my grandfather, did you know this and that and this? And he's like, those things aren't true. And I said, well, how do you know these? And he's like, we have all the information here. I forget the big green book.
The Proclaimer's book or the Insight book, one or the other.
The Insight, the Insight book. And I read that thing back to back, and I said, and I highlighted things, and I said, it says it right here. Some of the things that I'm touching on. And he said, yeah, they sure aren't, looking the best they could, but we have to. He's like, keep in mind that this was the infancy of the Christian congregation, and things have progressed and blah blah blah.
There's always a cop out.
Yeah, there's always a vague cop out. Yeah, and it's never an answer. It's always kind of a defense mechanism for you to just get exhausted about going round and round to where you just move on.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I saw with my grandfather. And it got to the point where we were talking about what's his name? Rutherford. Yeah, we were talking about Rutherford and how, I asked him about Beth Sarim. This was a place. This is a place in San Diego where he thought it would be wise for him to own a mansion while we're going through the Cold War, or the Depression, the Great Depression rather. And he's living this extravagant lifestyle, and his cop out for doing that, driving Cadillacs around and having this mansion, was that this was a place that the patriarchs or princes would be able to become resurrected and come back and have a place to stay.
Yep.
So we have, the leader of this organization living this lavish lifestyle off of the precious voluntary donations. I wouldn't even necessarily call them voluntary, just donations that people give to this organization to sustain its printing. Yet these funds are being used illegitimate and for the benefit of his lifestyle. And it was just a slap in the face to people at that time, where people were starving, and this is supposed to be God's one and only mouthpiece, the true organization. It just, even from the infancy, it was just so corrupt on so many levels that I can see that it just didn't make sense how it progressed, and all of the false predictions. And my grandfather just started shaking his head and saying that I sure had changed, and I'm headed down a real scary path.
because you dared to know what you were getting involved in. And then it's so sad that these people have devoted their entire lives and are so egoic, and their identity is wrapped up in this thing that they don't even know what it is.
Right.
I learned more about the organization I devoted my life to for decades in the 2 years after I left than I ever knew when I was in it.
Absolutely. Because you're looking at it with a critical mind this time, and it's not necessarily that you're looking for flaws, but you're looking for answers.
Yeah.
You're looking for where things don't absolutely make sense, where you can make sense of it. And we live in the age of technology. It's 2018. I think that the organization is like people that live in a town and only read that one newspaper. That's the publications that the Watchtower Bible Tract Society is. They only read those publications as fact. And they never take their opportunity or the time to look at outside resources, because they're told that that's apostate literature. And that's not the case. The internet is a place where it's a cumulative mind, a mass census. So we're able to determine what's BS and what's not based off of the mass majority mindset. And so when you have X amount of people agreeing that this and this isn't okay and this is corrupt, then that's just the facts. I'm sorry, but people don't allow themselves to open their mind or to do that external research because they're just so indoctrinated and they know how it's going to look to others, so they don't do it.
Oh yeah, and they get comfortable with their beliefs, and,
sure.
and you don't want anyone to question something you're so comfortable with, because it hurts now, and you can't tolerate that pain because you're comfortable. You don't want to change. You've devoted so much of your life at sunk cost, and you don't want to change. So
yeah.
So you're talking to your grandpa. You're having these conversations that clearly aren't going well.
Right.
You've already been through it with your mom and dad. So how does this build? How does it build off this?
So backing up a little bit. So basically it's around the same time. I was doing all of this debating with my grandfather and some of the brothers within the organization, and a lot of my free time I would ride dirt bikes. Like I was born and raised riding dirt bikes and stuff like that. And I remember going to basically a practice on a track out here in the local area, and I ended up injuring my back really bad and compressing 3 vertebrae and fracturing one in an accident. And at the time, I was doing all of this, debates with people, and it wasn't being argumentative. And I say debate in the slightest of terms as being a conversation of, let's figure this out, and I have a question, can you answer it?
Well, yeah, but it has to be a debate with them because they can't have a conversation.
Right.
There's no openness.
And so going through that, and once I got this back injury, I had to go to the doctor. They highly suggested that I did surgery. I couldn't do that because I was the sole proprietor of this business and operator. So I couldn't take any time off. To manage my pain, I was prescribed all of these prescriptions. Like we're talking Norco, Soma, Percocet, Vicodin, like the whole gamut, because some of them didn't work on me. Some of them did and then stopped working. And what I saw was, they were, extremely addictive. And they definitely made me feel not myself, like almost out of body, kind of in a haze, not focused, driven anymore. And it was evident. So at the time I was trying to make a transition where I thought like I was still going to pursue the fire career, because owning my business, I had enough free time to do more studies. So I went to EMT school. And during this time in the program, I was introduced to one of the instructors, and we got to talking about injuries and this and that and pharmaceuticals, because we were studying pharmacology and stuff like that. And he said, he said laughingly, like, oh, why would anybody take these, prescription drugs? He's like, why don't they just smoke a joint or something like that, to that effect? And that was the first time I ever thought, like, really considered the use of marijuana or anything like that as medicinal. Mm-hmm. I just always was told that it was, the gateway drug that led you into any other drug that you can think of. And mind you, at this time, I'm just dosed to the max on all of these prescription drugs. And so going through the schooling system, he said that jokingly, but he was kind of serious, obviously. So I did a lot of research and I looked into it, and I realized that there was a lot of medicinal value in, cannabis use. Mm-hmm, so, yeah. So, and I mean, people can have their view about it just like anything else. But what I saw in the Christian congregation was all of these elders' wives, elders themselves, but especially the elders' wives, some of them would come to the Kingdom Hall so conked out. It was very evident that they were on prescription medication, like pain meds, where sometimes when they were speaking, you couldn't even understand what they were saying, and these are the most spiritual people in the congregation, people that you should be looking up to, that are on these prescription drugs, and it's clearly evident. So when I decided for me, that I wanted to try this, I didn't tell anybody. And this would go on for years. So I dropped all the pain pills and prescription pills, and I would start using medicinal marijuana. And I got my license and all of that. Unbeknownst to my wife, unbeknownst to my family, no one knew. And I wanted to keep that way because I wanted to prove a point. And the point was, yeah. And the point that I wanted to make was, it's clearly evident that these people are using these prescription drugs at the hall. I want to be under the mindset that I want to do something that helps me. And if it helps me, great, I'll keep using it. And if it becomes evident to others, then that's when you might have an issue.
Right.
So I started using it for years, 3 years, in fact, before I would even mention it to my wife, because I eventually just felt guilty. My conscience just didn't allow me to keep that from her any longer. But for 3 years, she had no idea that I used it almost on a daily basis. I was running a very functional business that was growing each year. So there were no negative repercussions. We were very regular in, the ministry. I was reading from the stage. I had privileges. And once I told her that that's what I was doing, I mean, I wasn't shocked to her to have felt like I was keeping something from her. Mm-hmm. And I totally get that, because I probably would have had the same feeling, like, wow, that's kind of a big thing. Why wouldn't you mention it? But to me, I wanted to prove something to myself first. It wasn't, if it was evident to somebody, they would know and find out, and then it would be an issue. But I was able to manage it appropriately to where no one was the wiser. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
But like I said, my conscience got the best of me, and I felt like I was withholding some, pretty important information for my wife to know. So once I let her know that kind of started eating at her, and she thought like, oh, I don't know. I don't think so. And I tried to show her all the research that I had found, and where in the Bible, it doesn't say anything about it. If we're going to base our lives around the Bible, then let's read the good book and see where it says not to, or go ahead. So, and there's a scripture in the Bible that said God gave every seed bearing fruit to mankind to enjoy. Right. So, that's how I justified it, which was, well, if we're going to take the Bible literally, this is how I literally perceive it. Mm-hmm. And I didn't really care how anybody else did, and nor was I asking anybody at that point. But my wife ended up starting feeling real guilty that I was hiding this from the congregation and I had privileges. And she essentially wanted to go to the elders about two things at this time. She thought that we were like grieving God's Holy Spirit. We were lacking God's Holy Spirit because at this time we started having more and more arguments just about finances, just life itself. It was very evident that, with the relationship, we have ups and downs, but her mindset was when we have our downs, that's because we're spiritually weak. We need to go talk to the brothers.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So she used, number one, my marijuana usage as a catalyst. And number two, there was a little bit of fooling around that we had done before we got married. And she thought that we were grieving God's Holy Spirit because we were keeping that from the Christian congregation and the brothers. So not only did we get drug into a judicial committee for what both, me and my wife at the time had done prior to us getting married, but also the fact that I was using marijuana. So it was just compounded. So it wasn't a good time to do both at once. But in my mind, I was like, well, let's knock it out of the park. And I'm not going to just bow down and say I'm going to stop, but I'm going to try to prove a case. So we got at this time we got privately reproved for what we had done prior to us getting married. Mm-hmm. But in that meeting, we also mentioned the marijuana use, and it wasn't really that big of a deal. They really didn't really touch on it. They shared a couple of scriptures, and it was very vague. And we left there thinking like, well, they didn't touch on it too much. And my wife was like, yeah, but I still think that you should stop. So I did that for almost a year, which was, I stopped using it, and I was like, well, let's see if things get better. And with my pain, it only got worse. It was basically the reason why I used it was to go to sleep and stop tossing and turning, get some, a good night's sleep.
Yeah.
And what I realized was like, my health was starting to suffer because I was only getting 4 hours of sleep every night. And so I started using it again. I told my wife after that time of not using it, I said, I tried to do prescription pills. I tried to stop, and I found the best results while doing this. And you have to understand that it just works for me. Something might work for me, but maybe not for others. And I said, the way that I look at it, these chemical pills that are derived by man are way more harmful than something that's natural and that can still be managed appropriately. So once I kind of got her on board with that, she was okay with it. And that was pretty much that. And then we got called back into a meeting for the marijuana use. And this was because I still had privileges. And at the time,
you still had privileges, even though you were on I guess the private reproof wouldn't take those away. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that can differ from some halls, but yeah. I was still saying there might have been a slight period of time where we didn't have our commenting, but gotcha. It almost after I don't know, maybe 5 months, it almost went back to normal, like nothing had happened.
Yeah.
So I was reading the Watchtower, I was saying prayer and stuff like that. And helping with mics and stuff like that. But after we went back to the brothers about the marijuana use, this is the original hall that my parents moved us to when we came to the beach. So now it's my family in that hall and me and my new wife in this hall.
Gotcha.
And we're dealing with that committee about this marijuana use. And virtually at the end of the day, they're like, okay, well, there are some people that do use it for medicinal purposes. Do not tell anyone about it. And everything was fine. Everything was fine. We left that meeting. They were under the assumption that I would be using it still, that it wasn't an issue if I didn't make it one. And I was happy. I was ecstatic because it really, truly did help. And I felt like, wow, I took a stand for something, and, it's all working out. Then we start to associate with more friends in another congregation in the same town, and they kind of sway us. Because we were thinking about moving, and this is when the circuit overseer came and said, if you live here and you live in this this territory and your hall falls in this area, you need to go to that hall. So he was basically driving it in everybody's heads. Like, if you live on the other side of town and you're going to another hall on the other side of town, that is not okay. You need to go to the hall that is within your territory.
Right.
So we ended up moving to a different area down by the beach. We got a house down by the beach, and now we were in that territory where all of our friends that we were making that were our age. Because like I said, that hall that we were in, it was a bunch of old people, nobody really to associate with. So we moved halls, and now I start to double down on my spirituality because things are on the up and up. The business is good. We got a house down by the beach, like literally 5 homes from the sand. And I'm like, okay, I got free time. I start going out and service more. We're at this new hall. I'm trying to, make an impression. And at a certain point, that's all it was. Now that I think about it, about making an advancement spiritually for me was always an image thing.
Oh yeah, the whole organization's based on image.
Yeah, and how people perceive you,
Yep.
And it's all for face value, 100%. Mm-hmm. And so, me and her were on the up and up. We were going out and service more. And just a couple of months into being at that new hall, we decide to, around memorial season, pioneer, or like auxiliary pioneer. Mm-hmm. And so we're doing that. And it took almost 7 months for them to transfer mine and my wife's cards, like a little less under 2 miles from one congregation to the other. Okay. And yeah. And so when the cards finally came in, there was a note on there of my marijuana use. Uh-oh. Yeah. So I'm outside, we're outside after meeting for field service, and we're out in front of the hall, just, kind of talking to some other friends, making arrangements. And two of the elders approach me and say, they pull me aside and they want to talk to me. So my wife kind of looks at me funny, and like, I look at her like, yeah, I don't know, we'll see. And so they pull me aside and they say, hey, DJ, so we got your cards in. That's a good thing. And I was like, oh, wow, yeah, that is. That took a while. And they're like, yeah, we apologize for that. But what we did find when those cards were transferred is that it mentioned something about marijuana use. And they said, they didn't ask me. They just said, so you're not doing that anymore, right? They just assumed that I would have found my way to the right decision in their mind, which was not to use it. Right. And I said, no, I'm still using it. Like, I made it evidently clear in the last, I had a judicial committee about it and made it very clear in the last congregation that this would be an ongoing thing and everything was fine. And the brother specifically said, not in my hall. And wow. I remember that being the first thing, for the first moment from then on forward, where I would start to throttle back on my spirituality, because I was just, I don't get offended at all. It's virtually impossible to offend me. I don't even know how to put this or what words would be best fitting, but I just couldn't believe what had come out of this elder's, mouth, because he was the Kobe of the congregation, the presiding overseer, basically the head honcho in charge. And what I saw was these brothers perceive it to be their hall. Yep. That they're the managers of it. They're the boss hog. And I saw right through what he had said, and it just did not sit well with me. And it wasn't, let's get together and talk about it. It was not in my hall, which was clearly evident. He did not want to talk about it because he had a certain stance on it, and he was not willing to waver or debate about it. So after that, I told my wife what was going on, and she's like, don't let it get you down. Like, just only you and Jehovah know what works best for you. And if it doesn't bother you, it doesn't, it obviously doesn't bother me anymore. Just do your thing. And that would, like I said, be really the first thing where I would actively start throttling back on my my spirituality. So that was a big issue that I first started to have. So after that, I stopped. I mean, I still was going to meetings regularly. Don't get me wrong. It was just, well, I'm not going to do the extracurricular things. I'm going to focus on my business. I'm going to make all my meetings, but yeah. I'm not going to be searching for any privileges, and I'm also not going to be going out in service more than I have to stay quote unquote regular. So from that point, it was just my head down, my tail between my legs, and I was just doing it as a formality to keep my wife happy and my parents. So
yeah, it sounds like they didn't offend you. They just kind of took the wind out of your sails.
yeah,
I just kind of demotivated you.
Yeah, because I couldn't really fully understand how somebody can be so arrogant about such a touchy topic and not want to discuss it and just assume that they know better than you.
They proved that it was merely authoritarian. That's what it was about. It was,
absolutely.
Here you go. I'm the voice of authority, and I just told you no, and now you're going to fall in line.
Right. And I would definitely see, and I would see their point of view if there was an evident change in my personality, my lifestyle, my this or that. And that was, I hid it from everyone for years. So that was clearly evident that it wasn't an issue.
Oh, but Jehovah knows.
Yeah, exactly. and if Jehovah knew, then why was life going so according to plan in my mind? But yeah, so that was that. Like I said, from that point on, I just kind of stuck to myself and did just the bare minimum to keep, quote unquote regular. And then I really had an issue. Like I started to have an issue with, well, what else is a gray area? Because I wanted to, have facial hair for the longest time, and I never really questioned or debated that as well. I'm totally not the type of person that would do something out of spite of attention or wanting that type of attention. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But now we're getting to the point where I was starting to miss more and more meetings. And me and my wife were getting along as well because of my perception of what the organization started to become in my mind. So I told her, I just don't think it's absolutely necessary that I need to go out and service every weekend or X amount of hours or do extracurricular things. And it started driving a wedge in our relationship at that time. So for me, I was just like, whatever. I started growing a little bit of scruff, and I've always had really sensitive skin too, but that was 100% not the reason why I wanted to grow a beard. It's just for the longest time, I always wished I could. Sure. I just never understood why we couldn't. So because I was going less and less. You and every other brother. Right. So because I started going less and less to the hall, I started to grow this scruff, and I'd come from work with scruff on my face in work clothes, and I'd get those comments like, brothers scratching my chin, like, what's this? It's like I look down and I'm clearly in my work clothes. And that's just how it started. And once I saw how much of a issue it was, I was just like, I don't care. I just started growing a beard. And this included me just going to meetings with, it wasn't a full on beard like it is now, but it was evident that it was a well trimmed, and kept beard. And that was an issue. And, I got pulled aside and said, well, this, and this can't happen for you. Is that worth doing that? And I said, well, I'm not really reaching out to do those things. So it doesn't really apply to me, don't you think? And so I started to get a little bit more sarcastic with the brothers because I started to lose respect for them and the way that they would approach things. Like, you should know better, or I know better. And that's just that. And that didn't settle well with me. Mm-hmm. So, getting further along in my spiritual digression was me eventually going to less and less meetings, and telling my wife, there's just some things, I started studying doctrine, and mind you, I hadn't started doing any outside research, really for that, other than finding more information about, Russell or Rutherford. That was about it. That was the gist of what outside resources that I would do on Google.
Right.
And I still didn't touch any other information outside. I really dove into more of the doctrine. So when my wife would go to meetings, I would stay at home in my office and get some work done. And while she was still gone, instead of just, watching TV, which we didn't have TV the whole time we were married, I would just stay in my office and do research within the organization's publications. I'd get old publications from, that they stopped printing and wanted to fade out because there were some misguided doctrine and they were trying to, make sure that the public didn't see what had been written before and stuff like that. And I was really diving into what they had produced, what they had published, and things were just starting to fall apart for me within their own writings.
Oh, yeah.
And that's how it all started for me to eventually cease all, meeting attendance, service, everything, and, really start growing a little bit of a longer beard. And I saw an immediate drop off with people stopping associating with me. My parents started acting differently towards me. And especially my wife. That was the hardest part. Was we had multiple conversations about our spirituality, and I'm not the man that she had met. And I said, I apologize about that. You're absolutely right. There's a lot of things that I was doubting even from the beginning that I should have been upfront and honest with you, but it was just too sensitive of a subject back then. And it was just a lot to deal with. But now that I'm a little bit more established and I have free time, I get to dedicate that free time however I see fit. And I wanted answers. And the answers that were finding were not sufficient enough for me to dedicate my time or devotion to this organization any longer to the extent that they want. And she lost a lot. She lost all, if not most, all respect for me, once I took that stand for just saying, I doubt a lot of things. I'm not going to meetings anymore with you. She would hold over my head like I stopped doing, family study with her, and she was like, this is the very least that you can do with me. And I said, you know what? If there's one thing that the organization has taught me is it says to make the truth your own. And I said, you should be doing that yourself because I'm doing that. And this is the resolve that I'm finding. And it's not that I don't support you in what you want and what you would like to be doing, but you should see my side of it and do the same for me, which is I'm not pushing you down the path that I'm going, and nor should you be doing the same to me. And at the end of the day, this should have no factor bearing on our relationship. This should be our own personal resolve with our spirituality.
But that's what the relationship is built on when you're one of Jehovah's Witnesses.
Yeah, it's one of the main chords, right?
Yep, absolutely.
And that to me was the most devastating part, where it was how the organization drives into married couples' lives that Jehovah comes first.
Yep.
And at the end of the day, if that's what you believe in and you need that, that driving force to make things make sense to you, by all means. But at a certain point, I realized that is absolutely not the truth. Your family comes first, and most importantly, your mate. So in my mind, I just thought, well, she's not going to be accepting of how I view this religion and my mindset and my stance that I'm taking. So I'm going to go full force into my business. And that's exactly what I did. I wanted to provide for her more and more, and show her look I'm not falling apart just because I have a difference of beliefs. If anything, we're becoming better. And it wasn't meaning to be a materialistic thing, but it was letting her know that, I'm not falling apart. I'm driven, I have a mindset, and I wanted to prove that to her.
Well, yeah, actually, what you had said before too, in addition to that, was that, she saw that when things weren't going well for you guys, she saw that as a lack of Holy Spirit.
Yes,
so if you dive into your business and your business is doing well, is Jehovah blessing you now?
Right. It's funny that you say that, because that's exactly how I perceived it, which was if I was grieving God's Holy Spirit and I was acting directly against what he commands us, then why is, within the first year of me stop going to or attending meetings rather, my business grew 50% in 1 year. So this was something that was clearly evident that was not the case, because I always lived my life with the assumption that if I'm not doing exactly what I'm told, things will just fall apart.
Yep.
And that's not the case. What the case is when you actually use your mind and dedicate yourself to something, and you have that driving force and you stick to it, it will always work out for the better.
Yes.
And people in the organization can't understand that. They throw caution to the wind, and they throw up their hands and say, well, I'm going to let Jehovah take care of me. And they pray,
It's just another cop out.
It is, and it stopped making sense for me, and I wanted to prove that to my wife,
Yeah.
Without words, which is like, well, look, tell me that I'm doing wrong.
Right.
And it still was never good enough for her. She she just wanted a spiritual head, and I get that, and I can't fault her for something like that,
right.
because if that's something that she ultimately thought I was, then that was my fault. But what I could not get over was the fact that it was the determining factor or the make or break for our relationship, because it got to the point where she just didn't respect me at all. She would say disparaging comments to me about or to other people, embarrassing things that were private. And cool. Yeah. And I think in her mind, she justified it because she wanted to make me look bad to others, even if others looking outside in would see that wasn't the case. I was doing just fine not going, but she would throw these little tidbits in to, make me look kind of bad in a certain way. And, I think she just did that out of a defense mechanism for her own sanity.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, it wasn't fair. And, it got to the point in our relationship where we stopped having any intimate relations with each other.
Sure.
And it was because I could tell that she just never was into it anymore. And after about a year and a half of, very hit and miss intimacy, huge gaps in between, you start to really question, why am I even with this person then?
Mm-hmm.
And that's when things started to really fall apart for our relationship. Is she dove more into it, and I dove more out of it.
Yeah.
And I think it was a bit of stubbornness on both of our parts. And so when she dove more into it and I dove more out of it, we were almost living separate lives at this point, because she was just so inundated with spiritual things, and I was inundated with, pursuing other business opportunities and my business that I already, pre-existing business and household projects. Like, we just were on completely different schedules. We would virtually just eat together. And it got to the point where we just barely saw each other. So now we're to the point where I'm already questioning, like, why are we even together? Like, if we could have made this work, I'm trying over and over, like, just I accept you for who you are, just accept me for who I am. And it just wasn't ever good enough. And I remember distinctively, what was it? I think 2015, I was sitting at a bar waiting for one of my other friends to show up. And this friend was a lifelong childhood friend. And he was born and raised in the organization too, but he started to have doubts like me too. So we would kind of have our own little secret meetings.
Oh, wow.
And and we would just talk about doctrine and this or that, or what did you hear on this podcast, and blah, blah, blah. And it was kind of like my outlet,
Yeah.
Which was somebody who I can share a mindset with, of understanding of how the faith system works, this organization, and the doubts that you could possibly have and why you can justify those things. So as I'm waiting for him to come have a beer with me, it was at a local bar, like in my neighborhood. I'm sitting there waiting for him, and I get approached by this woman, and she said, "Do you have a couple of minutes? I'd like to interview for something." And I said, I mean, what is, it was kind of weird. I was like, what is this in regards to?
Yeah.
And she's like, well, and she sits down and she has an iPad, and she's like, I work for, like a commercial agency or this or that. And it'll only take 3 minutes of your time. And in my mind, I was like, yeah, whatever, lady, like, whatever. But I was just too nice. And I was just like, sure, let's do this. So she asked me all these questions and blah, blah, blah. And at the end, she was like, I know that you might think that this is weird, but I'm literally a talent scout, and I think that you would fit this role that we're looking for. And I was just like, okay, like, whatever. So I give her my email address. I don't think much of it. And, 2 weeks later, I get an email saying that she passed along that footage because she had a guy with a camera. pass along my footage of the interview to one of her superiors, and that they would like me to come to a casting call. So I'm like, I went from sitting at a bar getting interviewed by this lady thinking she was crazy to possibly being in some like commercial or something. And I'm thinking, well, this is cool. Like that.
Yeah.
I'm thinking like, well, why not? Like I have the extra free time, while my wife's doing her thing. Like, why not try to see where this goes? And I remember getting that email, and I ended up eventually going to that casting call, and it was for a Chevy commercial. And we do, basically I get selected, we do the shoot, and then they air it nationally. And I was so stoked on it because I was just like, this is so cool. This is so rad. It was so random. I was excited for it. And I was like telling my wife about it, and she just wasn't having it. Like you could tell that she was just faking the funk. Like, oh yeah, that's cool. Like, cause I was already going down a path that was making me more happy.
Yeah.
And like one thing after the other would be happening where these were opportunities that if I was grieving God's Holy Spirit, then why was everything being handed to me?
Because Satan was just drawing you in, brother.
And that exactly, and that's exactly how my parents and her perceived it, which was, this is how it happens. This is what you're doing, and blah blah blah. And so after her not being like supportive of it, I remember just being really bummed. Like, man, this was a cool opportunity for me, and I was just really stoked on it. And I would have hoped that you would have been at least somewhat excited, with me. And I wasn't getting that from her.
Yeah.
And so after that, our relationship was just starting to go further and further downhill. And, we're living more and more separate lives. And I ended up meeting another girl through, mind you, this is another Jehovah's Witness, through a buddy who was another, a Jehovah's Witness as well down south.
Mm-hmm.
And I would go hang out with this buddy every now and then because it was just kind of an outlet. Like if I wanted to get away while, my wife was with her super spiritual family in another town, I would just go down south and hang out at the beach with a buddy that I knew from down there. He was also a witness. I met, one of his friends, which was another sister in, the organization. and we started having more and more contact with each other. And at first it just started out with, just random, social media, like laughing, sending stuff. And then it turned into more of a conversation. And I started getting to know this person, and looking back at it, I think I was just trying to fill the void that I didn't have anymore with my wife, where I was just like, yeah, this happened. This was cool. And, I'm looking forward to doing this and that. And, just random stuff. And then over time, we started to develop, I guess, more and more of a relationship. And I stopped and I thought to myself, well, this isn't right, obviously. Like there was a real turning point where it turned into, wow, this person's just kind of like filling my void of conversation that I don't have with another woman, which would have been my wife. And now this other girl's giving me, this attention and really interested in what I'm saying. And it's vice versa. We have a lot in common.
Yeah.
And then somewhere in between, it turns, somewhat romantic to where she's wanting to like hang out and stuff like that. And I'm like, no, like this is not going to happen, blah, blah, blah. And for a while, I wrote it off. Like, there's no way, like, I'm going to just go hang out with her. But mind you, this is at a time in my relationship where me and my wife were virtually not talking. We were roommates at best. I was sleeping in my office for 3 months before it got to this point with this other lady. And it got to the point where I sat down my wife and I told her, listen, our intimacy has to change. Your view of where my spirituality has to change. And you just have to understand that that's just not where I want to be. But that should not affect our relationship together. I want to make this work, this and that. And she would say that she wanted to, but she would never take the necessary actions to change. And I got to a point in my mind where I was just like, I I can't do this anymore, you know. And I decided that I was going to leave. I was going to leave her. And then I wasn't even necessarily thinking about this other girl that I was talking. I just was like, well, how am I going to do this? You know, Jehovah's Witnesses are told, like, once you're married, the only way that you can remarry is if there's, you know, infidelity.
Right.
And I thought, well, I was so upset with the organization at this point because of all of the judicial meetings and the vague understandings or vague answers rather, and the way that my wife was starting to treat me because of my lack of spirituality, not my lack of taking care of her. I was really upset how it just threw my life into a downward spiral mentally. And so I was just like, well, if that's how they want to play the game, then that's how I'm going to go out. And so with this girl that I had been talking to, we ended up, sleeping together and started a relationship. And my wife ended up finding out. I told her what had been happening, and she wanted to make it work. And mind you, this relationship with this girl wasn't even to the extent where I was just like, oh, I'm going to be with this girl for the rest of my life. It was, the conversation had gotten to the point where me and her were under the understanding that we didn't want to be Jehovah's Witnesses anymore. And that's a really weird place to be with somebody who's a Jehovah's Witness in the organization, and you're speaking to another one with kind of the same mindset of how can we get out of this?
Yeah.
And I told her, well, if I sleep with another person, that in my mind was me doing my wife a favor, because number one, it got me out immediately. It was just like the nail in the coffin, and it allowed her scriptural freedom to remarry.
Yeah.
Because a lot of people don't understand with Jehovah's Witnesses, that is the only way that scripturally, a spouse can remarry and live another life with, happy life in that social construct or religion or that organization.
Yeah, they can never have another relationship for the rest of their lives unless you have a sexual relationship with someone else and it is admitted. If you can keep that on the down low for the rest of your life and no one ever knows, then your wife would have been stuck for eternity. Well, for however long life lasts, not being able to ever marry again, simply because of that.
Yeah. And this was something that was not just a heat of the moment, like passionate, idea or action. This was very, very, very methodical on my part. Now we're talking about 2 years of a period where I tried everything that I could do with making it work with my wife, maybe not spiritually, but everything else under the sun. And just because of the sheer fact that I wasn't the spiritual head that she wanted, my whole life went in a downward spiral as far as our relationship was concerned. And I had to get to the point where I was like, well, why are we together? I have different pursuits and goals and aspirations, and so do you. And I got to this place that, like I said, it was very methodical on my part. I thought, well, I'm not going to go through the process of separation or the divorce and then having to one day call up her or my wife and say, yep, I had sex with somebody, now you're free. Like, I couldn't imagine doing that to her. Right. So I thought I would rip off the Band-Aid and just get it done with. And that's exactly what I did with that girl.
And that was that, right?
Yeah. So, and so that, me and my wife were married for 7 years. Two of the last years were really, really hard, to where I had to ultimately come to that decision. And what got interesting was,
and it wasn't what you wanted either.
Absolutely not. No, I don't think people understand exactly what I was thinking, because they never had the opportunity to have that conversation with me. It was when I got disfellowship with Jehovah's Witnesses. As soon as you're disfellowship, everybody has to write you off. You are shunned. They don't talk to you. They don't know your side of the story and what had happened, because behind closed doors, they didn't know the in and outs of my relationship with my wife. They just saw DJ that didn't go to meeting, and he's the reason.
But they don't care about the truth. They just care about appearances.
Absolutely. And I was done with living that lifestyle, which was, I never felt myself. When I looked in the mirror, I pictured somebody else, and I was never that person. And it wasn't that I made such drastic changes where I completely changed and I wasn't the same person. there was just little changes that I needed to do to make me happy. And that did not include getting more spiritual.
Yeah.
That meant getting more close to my wife. That meant furthering our careers and getting to a happier medium, that we didn't have to be on the same page necessarily as far as spirituality was concerned in my mind, because if that makes you happy, go do it. And I try to say that to her so many times, like, I don't fault you for your belief systems. I will never judge you for it. But then it got to the point where she's like, well, I'm not going to raise, if we have children, I'm not going to raise them in a divided household where, their dad isn't a Jehovah's Witness and this or that. And I was like, in my mind, I had to deal with the hand that was given me,
Sure.
And that's the way I had to go out. Was obviously this relationship's not working. I don't want to be Jehovah's Witness anymore. And I would have rather lived under a freeway overpass than go back. And that's how strongly I felt, was I could lose everything that I worked so hard for, and I would still be fine with the free mindset and independent thinking, the ability to have that independent thinking outside that organization, and not the ties of a strained relationship anymore, because it was just so mentally exhausting.
Yeah. Once you're done with that, like, there's just no other way to be than just absolutely done. Like,
right.
You will do anything to get away from it. Whatever the consequences are fine. Like you said, if you have to go live under a bridge or whatever, like,
right.
It just is what it is.
Right.
And there is no choice. Once you know that that's not what you want in your life, it's not like it's something where you can, kind of be I don't know. It's kind of an all-in thing. It's very difficult to not. There are a lot of people out there, and I'm sure maybe who are even listening to this, who are physically in but mentally out. PMOs as they call them.
Right.
I think that if that's what you want to do, and you can do that, like, that takes a great deal of strength on its own front. It's very difficult to live that.
Right.
And obviously some people can do it or choose to do it for family or whatever. And that's awesome if they can do it, but some people aren't wired that way. There's just no way. I don't think there's anything, just for my personality type, that could have kept me once I knew better. I had to be out, but I'm just kind of an all or nothing person in certain ways, and we all have different personalities. So,
yeah. And I agree. I'm the same type of person, all or nothing. And I think that might be something that people that have enough, finding out from other people, when I was out, I didn't know anybody,
Right.
I was essentially a babe to the world. And I didn't have any friends. We're not allowed to associate with quote unquote worldly people, those that weren't Jehovah's Witnesses. So I'm somebody now at 26 years old, has no friends or ideas of
Yep.
just how to function without that social construct, because it's all uprooted from you. So there was a good portion of a year where I was just heavily drinking, because this is ultimately not what I wanted. I wanted my family. I wanted the things that I still had, minus that scriptural, mindset or that perception of religion. And it really did a devastating factor on my mind. But what I found was, through talking to other people that I started meeting, was how much courage it actually takes to do what you ultimately have to do to be happy. And I think that's one thing that witnesses that end up ultimately just throwing up their hands and saying, I'm done, I'm out, is it takes an extreme amount of courage. And you definitely have to be an all or nothing person to jump ship,
Yes, you do.
It takes a lot of effort to jump from, a ship that's already sailing, to jump into the freezing water, to swim back to shore, to build a boat just to get back out in the water again. It takes a lot more effort than just to ride that ship.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It takes a lot of effort to do that. And then, I know for myself, I was just very fortunate that my wife came along and jumped off the ship with me. Just
right.
That things just worked that way. But it's still like, it doesn't matter. Like, that's like one of the ways it's a cult, when there is literally no easy way to leave.
Right.
It doesn't matter if you if your spouse leaves with you, if your spouse stays behind, if you have children who stay behind, like, or if you stay in physically but mentally you're out, like there's just no real way to leave the cult without it negatively impacting you in a very harsh way.
Well, absolutely, and that's where it gets interesting too. Is that I had never been disfellowshipped before. I had only been privately reproved, so I had never really understood the negative ramifications of being disfellowshipped. Now, while I was still in the organization, disfellowshipping was something that I always just didn't really comprehend. But I think as a Jehovah's Witness, we just put it to the back of our minds and think, oh, this is just what has to be done, and you just write it off. But
Right.
Once you're actually disfellowshipped, you get to understand exactly how mentally manipulating it is to shun somebody, to where it's almost built by design that the organization wants you to fail. And they'll say up and down that they swear that that is not what they intend. But when you rip somebody's social structure, their friends and family, the only things that they were able to know because of the rigid rules and regulations, once all of those things are gone and you are tossed into this big, vast world, you can easily get lost. And for, like I said, a year after, we filed for divorce and I got a place, on my own. I didn't know anybody. What was I supposed to do after I was done working? All I did was drink, because I numbed myself from all of the emotions that I was going through, and I had no outlet, to, as far as the social structure was concerned, to talk to anybody. So I was just, I'm my own worst enemy in my own head, and they want you to fail and come crawling back.
Yep.
And I had at a certain point make a reevaluation of my circumstances and say, I have to better myself for myself and prove everybody wrong, and make an example for other people that are considering it, saying his life didn't turn to shambles, it turned into gems.
Yep.
And I think more people have to have that mindset, because the organization wants you to come groveling back and crawling on your knees and being battered so that you can understand what a loving organization is. And they're always going to be there with their arms wide open, but they don't understand how negatively it affects one's mental cognitive functions.
Sure. The best revenge is a life well lived. So,
right.
Go out, live a good life, and show them that they're wrong. I mean, that's all you can do. And I mean, ultimately, this is the only life that we know we have as human beings. Whatever a person believes other than that, that's fine. But, the only thing that we can literally prove that we have is this life. And every day that we get is a gift. And so, what else is there to do but to make it the best you can? Why would you choose to do anything else? So go have, you have to go have a good life, and hopefully, sometimes that is a good example for others who want to leave too. Right. I watched this person leave and their life didn't fall apart. Well, maybe there is something to this. Maybe there is something to leave in this organization.
Right. And I think we're definitely headed down that path. I think there's a trend that's happening where more and more people are leaving, and they're understanding that they have to get, for the longest time, the society didn't necessarily say, like, don't go seek, professional help as far as therapy was concerned, but pretty much so, in so many words, did say that, to avoid that thing, because now being outside of, the organization, I think it's becoming more and more of a trend with people that have left, that they understand that it can be so mentally devastating that they do have to, bandage those wounds before that they can continue, whether that's joining a community of ex-JWs or getting a hobby, something to better themselves and not to mull over the past, because it can be so destructive if you don't treat it that way. And that's something that I had to, spend some time learning, being out. But once you find a good source of people to surround yourself with that, understand what it could have been like to be raised and are open to religious conversations, it does wonders for your mind. And that's all I can, say for anybody who might be considering it inside the religion. Because I know there was 3 stages for me. When I was inside, doubting, on the fence, and then outside. They're all three different perspectives. And if you have the opportunity to go through those, you really do have to, possibly seek professional help or get a group of people that are supportive and not just do it on your own.
Yeah, you're not going to be able to do it successfully all alone. It's too big.
Absolutely.
It's just too big. So you've been out now for what, a couple years?
So approaching 2 years.
Okay. And are you, because I know, just because you're disfellowshipped, although shunning is the policy of Jehovah's Witnesses, at times not everyone's family lives up to that policy. Have you ever heard from your family again, or is that it?
It's funny that you mentioned that, because it's, I was taking care of some taxes. It's tax season over here. And I was filling out this form, and I remember the last real conversation I had with my mother was right before I was announced, and she helped me with a tax form. Huh. And that is such a weird thing to think about, is the last conversation that you had with one of your parents, like a real conversation, was about, business or finances, not like, how are you doing? How's the family?
Schedule C on your tax
form. It was just some business formalities that she was aiding me with. And, there has been times where I've seen them at family functions, but what's such a trip, and I do not understand this, and I don't think I ever will, is that because me and my wife are no longer together, they still treat her as family. So if I'm going to a worldly family function, like my mom's grandparents' anniversary, for instance, which happened a couple months back, they showed up with another witness family that's not related to our worldly family, and they brought my ex-wife. So they're going on vacation with her, they're traveling with her, they're bringing her to family functions that normally we would have went together with, but we're not together anymore, and they're treating her as like a replacement. And
yes,
I don't understand that.
I think that they feel, I've seen this before, I think that they feel guilt that they didn't do something right in raising you that made you the faithful witness husband that she should have had. And right. I think that they are trying to atone for it by essentially adopting her as your replacement. It is so fucked up.
It really is.
It's so strange. But I've seen it before. It's really weird.
It's so weird that when worldly people, I'm just going to use the word worldly, because now that I'm outside, everybody who I associate with outside the organization is quote unquote worldly to people inside the organization. But when I mention that and they see it and I show them pictures, they're just like, what the hell, dude? That is so, it doesn't even make sense on so many levels.
No.
That it's just even weird to somebody who doesn't really understand that, if one's disfellowshipped and the spouse stays in, that they can still maintain some relationship with the person, but they literally replaced me with her, and she does absolutely everything with them still as if I had died.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So witnesses believe that essentially, so your parents believe that you will die at Armageddon and they will live on into this panda paradise. And they think that, I've literally seen people write this online of experiences or heard it where their parents are pretty much of the mindset that, well, so, Job in the Bible, he had all these kids and God allowed Satan to destroy his children. But hey, God gave Job a whole nother bunch of children later in life. So it's okay. Yeah. So it's okay. Sure, he lost Johnny and Susie, but he gained Mike and Jenny or whatever. You know what I'm saying? So
absolutely,
it's this really messed up thing. And there are a lot of witness parents out there who not only after their son or daughter leaves the organization will replace them like they've kind of done here with your ex-wife, but they honestly somewhere in their deranged minds at this point think that, Well, I'll just, in the new system, I'll just have replacement kids for the ones I lost, and I won't even miss them anymore. I mean, it's the most messed up, detached, narcissistic thing. And that is somehow like at the core of this faith that they have, that they can do that. It's
I'll never understand it.
No, it's messed up. You can't understand it because you got your humanity back. They still have their stripped from them, you know? And I don't know. It's just mind blowing.
Yeah. And, you know, at the end of the day, it's so interesting because I had a conversation with my aunt now being outside. You know, I'm rekindling these relationships. Like, take, for instance, my sister who, you know, ran away at 16. There was a huge gap in years where we barely talked or saw each other. And she now has 5 boys. I have 5 nephews.
Oh, that's awesome.
It's crazy. And it took me over a year to reach out to her to say, I apologize for not contacting you when I was an adult, and I could have easily came and saw my nephews. And, you know, I contacted my aunt, my dad's sister, who was disfellowshipped when she was 19 and it's been out for almost 30 years. I'm rekindling these relationships, and it was strenuous at first because I have to admit and apologize for being a grown ass man not talking to somebody because they didn't believe the same thing that I did and my family did.
But they probably understand.
They did, and they welcomed me back with open arms, and they said there's absolutely no need to apologize, and they couldn't be more supportive. And I just talked to one of my aunts the other day, and she was just like, one thing I don't understand, DJ, is how your parents could, even if it was that you just had an affair with your wife, my mom did that to my dad as well when they were married. The only difference was they stuck it out and stayed Jehovah's Witnesses. But now because I don't believe the same thing and I did the same thing, but it's for completely different reasons. My mom and father are shunning me because of something that they had went through. It doesn't make any sense at all.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't.
And the difference is I chose not to stay with my wife because ultimately I knew it would be better for the both of us. Not I wanted to ruin her life and ruin mine. It was, number one, I couldn't do that, be spiritual anymore or be a part of that organization. And I wanted to let her be free. And there were certain steps that have to be taken within that organization that you're going to be the problem. You're going to be the reason why that everything failed is because you took that immediate out and you didn't want to make it work. And that's just not the case. And people won't ever understand that. And that's why I love, what you're doing is because you're giving people that have left a voice to tell their side of the story so that if anybody should come stumbling up across this that still might be in and might know that person, they're going to be like, oh, wow, there is a second side of the story,
Yes. Yes. I didn't think about it that way, but yes, to show the other side, because, I've always thought about, doing this as a way to give a voice back to the voiceless, because shunning is a way to shut people up.
Yeah.
And yes, it absolutely is. Here's the other side of the story. Here's the side that you're not allowed to hear, that you're not allowed to think about. And there are a lot of other stories out there of people who have never been heard, and it feels good to be heard and validated. And I don't know, it's so gross what they do in trying to. I mean, they're like little kids sticking their fingers in their ears and going la la la. You're like, exactly. I can't hear you. It's so immature, and it really is. And it's I'm so honored that people want to tell their stories with me, doing this,
right,
and put out that other side. It's I don't know, it's a really cool thing to be able to do.
Absolutely. And that's the way that I viewed it. Was I got so low, and on paper when I was married and part of that organization, people outside looking in thought our life was perfect.
Yeah.
And I don't blame them for the way that things looked at face value, but that absolutely wasn't the case. And now being shunned, I essentially lost everything that I worked hard for.
Yep.
But what I still have left that the organization can't take away from me is my voice and my side of the story. So I want, like, if anybody were to, question theirs and, whether there's somebody who might know me or not, I want to give that person an outlet that I found too when I was wavering in my beliefs, was listening to podcasts about religion and people, how they left their faith. It's not easy, but what people have to understand is that you have to be methodical about it. If you're being manipulated, manipulate the situation back, because you need to come out on top to sustain your sanity.
Absolutely.
And yeah, so things like this, where people are telling their side of the story and how they navigated around those things, I think, will do wonders for increasing the amount of people that gain that courage to jump ship and swim back to shore and start over fresh like they deserve to.
That's very well said. So what would you like people to know, like, who have never been Jehovah's Witnesses, to know about the religion? Like, if you could tell somebody out there who's never been a witness, other than your story, like, is there anything that you think that they should know about this cult?
No, I mean, you just said it perfectly. I think that the only thing that I would say is that it absolutely is a cult. And that took me some time, even outside of the religion, to come to the conclusion of believing. Yeah. And, Jehovah's Witnesses will say, oh, we don't define ourselves as a cult or accept that type of terminology. But if anybody outside is looking at Jehovah's Witnesses like they're just a fun-loving group of well-dressed, well-spoken people, they'd be absolutely correct. But it's not by choice. They're robots that is just conditioned to parrot and project what they're taught through the publications that they're only allowed to read. So that, to me, would define a cult at its finest, which is, this is what you get to take in, and this is what you do, and if you waver, you're shunned. And I was just talking to somebody the other day, and I said Jehovah's Witnesses are like the Hitler regime of our time, which is essentially ethnically cleansing the earth, which is you don't believe or support this, well, we have nothing to do with you, and this is the last time Jesus is coming to your door.
Oh yeah, I mean, their greatest hope in life is that Jehovah God institutes the great war of Armageddon to kill billions of people and wipe them off the face of the earth, just so this band of 8 million people, so their lives can be made a little easier.
Right.
I mean, what a horrific, dystopian thing to think, that your only hope in life, that the only thing you can look forward to is the destruction of literally everyone and everything around you, so that you can go hug a panda on a paradise,
Yeah, absolutely. And honestly, that was one of the first things that went through my mind, as far as really understanding what I was a part of, when if people just had people in the organization just had the ability to go from the very beginning, the furthest back, all the way to Adam and Eve and the great sin. They were instructed not to do something, they did it, and we all had to suffer. And we are basically chess pawns in God's game of proving his, Satan the devil wrong. And along the line, look at how many people have died because of this game. Right. And it's just getting to the point where, they're saying, oh, we're living in the times of the end. No, we've always said that. The only difference that has changed is that we live in the age of technology, and the availability to share information is becoming increasingly more and more available to people, to where they're able to see the ins and outs, the good and bad of what's going on. And of course, the bad is going to be highlighted because it's the most interesting. Right. But, take, for instance, living in Genghis Khan time, like, that was the end of the world. You know what I'm saying?
Right. Would you rather live today or show up in the Roman Colosseum?
Yeah, exactly. And people don't like to look at it like that. That to them was the end of the world. They would probably rather die than live. Sure. And now we're, throwing our Ugg boots on and walking to Starbucks thinking, meteors are going to come down from the sky.
Oh, but apostates are talking badly about their religion.
Exactly.
What a horrible time to live in.
It's ridiculous. I just really wish that people would take a deeper look and reevaluate their situation, even at the smallest level, going, like I said, all the way back to the beginning and Adam and Eve, and how it's just all just a game between if there is a God, somebody who's dominating his power. So, or exertion of power.
Now that you are out,
Mm-hmm.
is there anything that you've learned, since being out that has really, helped you grow? Is there anything any books, any podcasts, videos, anything that has helped you grow as just a human being, or just helped you kind of clear your mind of, the past or understand it?
Yeah. What I learned about myself, first of all, being outside, was I didn't realize how much stress and anxiety that I had within the organization that it caused me. And people tend not to understand that while they're in, is that, do you ever look at what you're a part of as being the cause or the root of whatever suffering you may be going through? People don't want to believe that might be the case, but in mine, it absolutely was. Because after I went through that period after leaving, there was a good year where I didn't want to deal with my emotions, and I just was heavily drinking and just numbing myself. But once I really started to take a stand and meet the right people that motivated me to just dude, just do your thing, start living for yourself, and stop thinking about the past, because it'll just repeat itself. And once I started to reevaluate what I wanted out of life, whether it was doing this hobby or dedicating this time to that, you really once you start living for yourself, it's like the illustration of, in an airplane incident, where if you're supposed to put the mask on your face first before you can even help a child sitting next to you. So once you understand that you really ultimately have to take care of your well-being before you can be beneficial to anybody else, that's when you start growing. And for me, I started to become more of a kind-hearted, understanding individual that was really humbled by the experience. And a lot of the help that I had along the way was, listening to Joe Rogan and some of the scholars that he has on, and then diving deeper into those scholars. Lloyd Evans, in his book, The Reluctant Apostate, where he jumps in. He used to be an elder. I'm sure you're familiar with him. And you get a understanding. If there's any Jehovah's Witnesses that might be listening to this, they're still in the faith. Like, this is taken from a perspective of somebody who, if he didn't tell you that he wasn't a Jehovah's Witness and you just heard his voice, you would think that he still was, because he debates in the utmost respect and uses only their publications to debate.
He's very good.
And that's what I loved the most, when I was just kind of dipping my foot into, quote unquote apostate material, was he didn't use any outside resources other than really diving into their own publications and pointing out key points of, well, this is how it can be perceived, and that's how they perceive it, but this is how it should be perceived. Don't you agree? And maybe you don't, but in a lot of the cases I did. So his book and his YouTube channel was very instrumental of me starting to dive deeper into, the publications themselves within the organization. And then also Ray Franz, crisis of conscious, and things like that. These are the catalyst things that I would recommend anybody that might be wavering or maybe outside looking for a sense of purpose. It really does give you a good outlet to justify the feelings that you have. And there's nothing better than, just feeling good about how you feel about a situation, especially when everything's stacked against you. All the people that you know or knew think that you're in the wrong, even though in your mind you feel that you're not.
Yeah. So you've obviously learned a lot, gotten some new, some fresh perspectives. What do you enjoy about your new life, since you've been out?
What I love about my new life is the fact that, I work so much and I'm busy. I work 6 days a week, and a lot of that had to do with just filling time that I had now. It was a lot of free time now that would typically go towards, dedication to my spirituality and meeting attendance. And once you have that free time, you can really dive into what you enjoy. There was a recent broadcast that JW's put out that that I watched that was talking about the unnecessary things of life, and they're filling a bucket with rocks, and there's big rocks about like personal study, Bible reading, field ministry, and all the little rocks is all the bullshit that you'd rather do. And, it's like take out all these little rocks so the big rocks could fit in because they matter most, and then sprinkle in some of what you want to do. But in actuality, if you're not doing what you want to do, then you're truly never going to be happy.
Yeah.
And you're never going to progress in life. You're just going to be stagnant. And I think that that's the worst place to fall into.
Yeah, I agree. It's the cause of a lot of depression, anxiety, just misery in life when you're living an inauthentic life that's not what you really want to do.
Right.
And
so,
it
doesn't have to be extreme. And that's what my parents or my ex-wife would say is like, what is so beneficial to you now that you justify not coming back? And it's like, you don't understand. It's so many things on so many different levels that you'll never understand because you're not questioning the finer things. And until you do that, you won't understand.
Yeah. I don't know. I was just thinking about how they can never, you said they could never understand. There's a moment when you wake up and you're finally free. There's a feeling of relief that comes with that we all want for our loved ones to feel someday.
Absolutely.
And it's something that I would say, sadly, maybe for myself, at least, I felt like, I think there's almost a high that comes with that you can't get again in life without, I guess, going back into some other torturous prison.
Right.
and coming out the other side. But there's a peace that you get when you can just wake up each day and realize that, this is your life and what you do today is your decision. And you're not looking to somebody else to tell you what you should do, how you should think, how you should feel. And I really wish, I hope, for your sake and for the sake of those that you love, that as witnesses, we would always, if we had friends or family who were disfellowshipped or whatever, we would say, well, as long as there's time in the system, there's time for them to come back.
Right.
Well, I'll flip that and say, as long as there's time in those people's lives, there's time where, who knows, maybe statistically, at least one more person from our past comes out and maybe someday we get to reunite with them. And so I always try to hold out that hope. Even though, it's a total crapshoot and there's no guarantees, who knows, maybe someday we get to talk to some of those people again.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I look forward to hopefully that time being sooner than later. There's so many issues, in the news that the organization's being criticized for, and it's just becoming more and more prevalent, not to people, outside the organization, obviously, but to people inside too, that there's a lot of things that the organization is covering up and not making public for a reason. And, once people start to wake up, it's going to be because of the scrutiny and the criticism that the organization's under. And it's going to start lighting a small fire for people to really look at the inner workings of, the governing body and the things that they've been involved with the past. A lot of people don't know that, the investments that they've made in military and, been part of the UN, even though we're not supposed to be a part of this world. It's one thing after the other that if people just did the slightest amount of research, and that's the problem with the organization is every day they want to just drive in new information, new light. Like you're so over inundated with new information, you never have a chance to take a step back. And it's funny being outside of the organization, you would think that, somebody would, they would crawl back or find their way, and that being outside would make them feel like they need to study and learn. But in fact, I thought that would happen to me. In fact, it's driven me further because I've had that time to be more introspective and look into these things. And it's making me more and more disgusted for even being ever associated with an organization that can call themselves the quote unquote truth and hold those people to those high expectations.
Yeah. it's hard to look back and believe that you once were involved in this, this
Mm-hmm.
cult. You kind of already touched on it a little bit, but I just wanted to ask, if you had a moment and you could say anything you wanted to your friends or family that shun you, what would you say? Is there anything that you'd like to tell them?
I would tell them to really sit down and think about what your intuition is telling you, not what is expected of you, because you can let that get carried away and it can become your life and your mindset. But once you start to really evaluate your intuition and what you're internalizing and let that speak to you, it will guide you to what you should be doing. And I doubt that it's what they think it is. They just don't allow themselves to just tease the idea of questioning. And once, I think that God gave us free will for a reason, if, God does exist. And that's,
Right.
and if there's one thing that the organization taught me, it's to fight for what I believe in. And now it's not that.
Yeah. I always found it a little curious that they would, harp on the free will we had, but yet they would essentially take that free will away through their policies and procedures.
Yep.
as an organization. It's very hypocritical.
It is. Yeah, it very much so is.
Does your past life, I guess, how does your past life affect you today? You're a couple of years out. It's not really that long when you compare it to the length of time that you spent in.
Sure.
And clearly, I think all of us doing this podcast or listening to this podcast today are in some way still, in a process of recovery that it will probably last a lifetime. But is there any specific way, anything right now that you kind of struggle with from it? That
I honestly, it just coming to the terms, or, the fact that when I'm, for whatever reason, I don't know why, but when I meet new people, inevitably religion and my, past will come up, just because that's all I had known for so long. And so when they come to find out that I was a part of that, they say to me, not because I'm living this, super crazy lifestyle that is not in accord with the Bible. They just straight up tell me, you do not strike me as somebody who would ever be a Jehovah's Witness. And I take that as a compliment now, is because to be associated with such a like-mindedness is not a good feeling once you're outside of it. When you realize how indoctrinated these people are, they're almost like you are a robot. And so what I've learned being outside of it is to really think for yourself and apply critical thinking and reason with everything, not just religious or spirituality. It's everything in life.
Oh yeah.
And that's how you make good decisions in life, is when you really criticize every aspect, you question everything and come to a firm understanding that way. It's priceless.
I like that you said that you're not afraid or ashamed to make your story known, because that's been a big deal for myself and my wife. And it's one of those things that if you're vulnerable and allow yourself to be vulnerable, people respect that. And, they will have a greater understanding of, let's face it. I think all of us that leave the cult of Jehovah's Witnesses, or any cult, that has people isolated, we fit in, but only to an extent.
Right.
There are a lot of social things that I don't get. There are a lot of cultural references that maybe I don't get. I didn't watch a lot of the popular movies and things like that. And I may not get certain references, but when you are open enough to tell people your story, they gain a better understanding of you, and then it's easier to make friends. But you have to be willing to put yourself out there, and it's scary. It's not easy to do.
It's definitely not easy to be in such a vulnerable position. Sure. But what I understand is that I have nothing to lose, and I'm not ashamed of my past. I'm ashamed of what I had to do to get to where I'm at now, especially being married and having to do what I had to do to her. That is something that will always haunt me, because there's a big stigma about that. There's a big label about men or women that, cheat on their spouse. But what I want people to understand is that sometimes your hand is forced in a decision, and ultimately you have to make something that goes innately against your standards or morals, because they put those things in place, not because you want to just ruin somebody's life. And that's what I think is most important for people exiting, is to tell their story, their side of the story, that it's not all that somebody just lost their mind and they lost their way and that they just don't know what they want. It's not the case,
Yeah.
And what, people tend to forget is, we're not the same people over time. And if you get married super young, inevitably you guys are going to change. You guys are going to grow together, or you're going to grow apart. Even science says that all of the cells in our body replace themselves in, something like 10 years. So technically you're a completely new person.
Mm-hmm.
And unless you have somebody by your side who's willing to stick through thin and thin and understand, and you guys don't have to agree upon everything, but if you guys want to make it work, you have to be a little wavering in what you might like or not like, just for the sake of, working it out with your spouse.
Yeah. You're not, Jehovah's Witnesses put an unnecessary burden on married couples that essentially they are to be carbon copies of one another. you know, that they are to have this, they're to be unified in the cult, essentially, beliefs. And it's so unfair, because that's just not, a couple is typically two people who, although they may have some similar interests, I like this. There was a quote I heard one time, and it's, if the two of you are exactly alike, then one of you is not necessary.
Right.
and I really like that. You want to be in a relationship with someone who brings something different to the party.
Right.
You don't want carbon copies, but we were raised in an environment where you did want carbon copies. You wanted other people to think like you and feel like you in everything. And it's such an unfair, unrealistic expectation.
Yeah.
And it really negatively impacts a lot of relationships.
Absolutely. And I know it might sound cliche, but one of the quotes that really got me by through those struggling years was Kurt Cobain saying, "I'd rather people hate me for who I am than love me for who I'm not." And I thought that was so fitting within the organization, is that sometimes you find yourself just living a life that is not you. And you come to that understanding and you're just like, I can't do this anymore. And I would rather those people hate me for that than, love me for who I was just perceiving myself to be in front of them. It's the weirdest thing to explain.
Absolutely. So now you've got this new perspective. Now you get to be you. What do you have any dreams for your new life? Is there anything that you got any plans in the works, or anything that you're hoping to achieve other than just happiness?
Yeah. I mean, other than just being happy every day, I've done a lot of traveling, which has been great. It's been getting my mind off of a lot of things and seeing, experiencing new places, and that's been really great. I'm getting into real estate, so I'm going to be holding on to the business that I already have and just getting into something that I think that I would enjoy. And I never got to that availability. I was kind of thrusted into the workforce just for the sake of being independent, but I never really questioned exactly what I would rather be doing.
Right.
And I think with that line of job, as far as pursuing real estate, it would allow me to, have a little bit more of a flexible schedule than I do now, as well as, different amount of income to where it would allow that I could have more time off to do more extensive traveling. And that's essentially what I'm aiming for, is leaving, for months at a time, if at all possible, to different places to really take in different cultures and understand the world even more than I'm starting to know it as it is now.
Yeah. I love that. That sounds awesome, man. Did I cut you off? I don't know if I cut you off there.
Oh, no, not at all.
I don't know if you had any other dreams you were wanting to throw out there, but I think that's awesome. I've never been able to go out and experience different cultures. But in our business, we work around people at times who have been able to, and just the lessons that they've told us that they've learned from doing so, and the beautiful people and things they've been able to see in their travels. I mean, in the end, life is about experiences, and to be able to have those experiences and have that shape and mold who you are, that's one of the more beautiful things you could hope for in life.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree anymore.
I want to thank DJ for being so vulnerable and for telling his story. I also wanted to add something here to clarify something for people that might not be familiar with the policy of Jehovah's Witnesses regarding divorce. What DJ says here is true, and I know it sounds crazy, but Jehovah's Witnesses teach that the only real grounds for what they call, quote, scriptural divorce that gives you scriptural grounds to remarry, is adultery. That's it. So you can get divorced for other reasons, though honestly they frown on that, but maybe let's say that you were being abused or something like that you were in physical danger. Of course, they're always going to push you back toward the abuser as many times as they can, but they will sometimes allow divorce for that. Well, I mean, you can get divorced whether you want to or not, or whether they allow it or not, but you're not scripturally free to remarry as they see it unless it is due to adultery. If you do remarry, you must prove that your former spouse has moved on sexually to someone else, or you might face discipline within the congregation. You could be disfellowshipped or reproved. And yes, I'm serious about this. This is real life. A woman might get divorced because her husband beats her, but her sexuality is forever linked to the abuser until he takes it elsewhere and admits to it, or maybe remarries himself or something like that, which would obviously show that he has moved on. So you can hear how DJ doing what he did was uncomfortable for him. You can hear how he has regrets. Hopefully you can imagine the ridiculous pressure put on him by this cult, pressure that neither served him nor his wife nor anyone involved. This whole issue of divorce in the cult is super messy and dysfunctional, but they see it as God's law, and he knows best. So surely that these rules that are clearly not fair and that don't work and are very dysfunctional, they must be best because they're from God as they see it. If you want to leave a comment for DJ, you can do so at shunnedpodcast.com. Again, that's shunnedpodcast.com. Just click on the episodes page and you'll see his story there. You can leave comments there. You can also see more information and links to resources there. DJ will have the opportunity to respond to you too. So, it's encouraging when people interact after somebody has been so vulnerable to try to help others with their story. Now, next month, we have a story of an amazing woman named Brenda that escaped the FLDS cult. For those who are unfamiliar, FLDS stands for the Fundamentalist Latter-day Saints. So it's kind of like a fundamentalist Mormon denomination. Their leader, Warren Jeffs, is in prison as a convicted child molester and is currently serving a sentence of life plus 20 years. He still controls the group even from prison. I don't know if you've ever seen the show on Hulu called The Handmaid's Tale, but if you are, then you're familiar with the concept of a group that sees women as objects in just about every aspect of life. And in a world where women are reaching more and more for their rights and hashtags like Me Too are trending, this is an interview that I think women will be really attracted to hearing. There are still places, even in the United States, where the culture of oppression of women dominates. Of course, the interesting thing is that, many women in this culture think they're happy. And let's not forget that, it's not healthy for the men either. The impacts of this group on their members, of whether they be men or women, it's fascinating, but it's also really frightening. A look into a world that many of us cannot fathom, but that is so real and hurting real people out there. So look for Brenda's episode the first week of May. If you haven't already, now would be a great time to subscribe so that you won't miss it when it comes out. Now, I've had people reach out to me asking if I have any ways to support the show financially. You can always support the show by leaving a positive review on iTunes. That really helps because it helps get the word out so that more people can find it and maybe they can get help themselves. But I've also gone ahead and started a Patreon page where you can donate to the show now if you like. I do have ongoing costs every month that I put out there to keep this going. Now, don't worry. I'm not going to discontinue the show. I'm not going to be one of those people who threatens to, I can't continue this show if you don't donate. I'm not going to do that. I hate that. I'm going to do this show whether anyone pitches in or not, because this is important to me. It's important to the people that get to tell their stories. And, hopefully it's important to you too as you listen. With that said, there are ongoing costs, and I'm taking a course in search engine optimization right now to try to help get this message out even more. Part of the SEO efforts could be having transcripts produced to help produce more content on the site. But it's looking like that could cost anywhere between $30 and $50 per episode to get that done, depending on the length of the episode. And that's for a computer-generated transcript that's done with the program. That's not an actual human doing this. So, that's even the cheap way to get this done. I also pay for hosting for the audio of this podcast and also this JW Life. For the hosting of the website, I spend time managing plugins, responding to emails, cutting out spam, interviewing people, producing audio. I've purchased microphones, audio recorders. I even purchased a new laptop because my old one was old and underpowered. So, I'm all in on this. I will continue to be. This is not going anywhere. But if you choose to donate, don't think I'm getting rich off this or anything. If you want to help defray the costs, you can go to patreon.com/shunned. Again, that's Patreon, patreon.com/shunned. And you can sign up there to become a donor if you like. I don't have any rewards for you. There are options to set up rewards for people for donating. This podcast itself will have to be the reward for now. It's enough for me to keep up with already. I don't have time to create anything special on top of that. But if you do choose to donate, I really appreciate it, and it does help defray the costs. I also had some T-shirts made for this JW Life that I wore on a visit to Brooklyn. That I posted some pictures of myself and my wife wearing those shirts, and there were people who liked it and were like, where can I get this shirt? I didn't, that was really my story. So I kind of felt weird selling shirts that other people would advertise with just my story on it. So I'm thinking about making some T-shirts for Shunned, and if anyone has interest, let me know. I'm going to get some made for my wife and I, see how they look first. And then, I'll let you know. That could be another way to maybe support the show. If I make a few dollars on a T-shirt sale, that might, go to some measure of defraying costs. But, all that aside, thank you so much for listening, for supporting what I do here, for the reviews on iTunes, for the beautiful emails that I get from people, for the comments that you give to people that I interview. That's encouraging to me to see, people get involved and support one another, really just for everything. I had no idea what power doing something like this could have in my own life, and on the lives of those that get involved, the lives of people who tell their story and then seem like they're so much freer, emotionally from kind of walking up and unloading their baggage on some level. This isn't just an audio program. It's people's real lives, a slice of life that was silenced by these religious groups, and I'm glad that we can all come together and give this voice back to the voiceless. So as always, love others, do no harm, and go be happy.